MOLL CUTPURSE, Mary Frith and the Making of a Legend. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Ivy. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without written permission of the author. Preface. There are some women the archive tries to bury and some it cannot stop talking about. Mary Frith, better remembered by the sharper, rougher name MOLL CUTPURSE, belongs to the second kind. She survives in court records, pamphlets, sermons, gossip, theater, scolding moral tracts, and scandalized memory. She appears in fragments and flashes. A hand in a crowd, a woman in men's clothes, a singer with a lute, a thief in the streets, a broker of stolen goods, a body on public display, a name passed about with disgust, delight, fascination, and fear. She is one of those figures who seems at first glance too vivid to be true. And yet she was true enough to frighten respectable London. That perhaps is where this story begins. Not with certainty but with unease. For centuries, women like MOLL have been flattened into convenient shapes. They are made into warnings, jokes, monsters, curiosities, heroines, or symbols. They are told and retold until the flesh of the original person disappears beneath the weight of other people's needs. In MOLL's case, the process began while she was still alive. She was not merely known, she was performed, exaggerated, mythologized, sold. Her notoriety was a kind of currency. The city gaped at her and, in gaping, made her larger. But fame is not the same as truth. The woman at the center of this book lived in a London that was dirty, crowded, violent, theatrical, hungry, and deeply anxious about order. It was a city of markets and prisons, of taverns and churches, of apprentices, actors, cutpurses, informers, magistrates, prostitutes, preachers, and pickpockets. It was a city that depended on performance in more ways than one. Social rank was performed. Gender was performed. Morality was performed. Respectability was performed. Punishment was performed. In such a world, it is no surprise that someone like MOLL, who blurred categories so publicly and so profitably, should become irresistible. She was accused of theft. She moved among criminals. She was linked to stolen goods. She wore men's clothing and refused the narrow behavioral cage built for women of her time. She made herself visible in places where visibility itself was a kind of provocation. She scandalized church authorities. She fascinated playwrights. She irritated moralists. She entered the bloodstream of London legend. And yet the closer one gets to her, the stranger the picture becomes. Was she a common thief elevated by gossip into something grander? A hustler with sharp instincts for survival? A master of self-fashioning? A criminal entrepreneur? A public nuisance who understood exactly how notoriety worked? A woman punished not only for what she did but for what she represented? The answer, frustratingly and wonderfully, is that she may have been all of these at once. This book does not set out to rescue MOLL CUTPURSE by turning her into a modern heroine. Neither does it seek to condemn her in the language of the men who tried to discipline her. It aims instead to do something both simpler and more difficult, to place her back into the world that made her legible. To understand her, we must understand the city that feared disorder yet fed upon spectacle. We must understand a society obsessed with boundaries, between male and female, lawful and unlawful, public and private, labor and vice, body and costume, shame and entertainment. MOLL walked straight through those boundaries and, in doing so, made herself unforgettable. That does not mean she was free. Quite the opposite. Women like MOLL were watched with merciless intensity. Their bodies, their speech, their clothes, their movements, and their choices were scrutinized as though every deviation threatened the moral architecture of the realm. A man who stole was a criminal. A woman who stole, dressed defiantly, occupied public space too boldly, and refused feminine modesty could become something far more troubling, a spectacle of disorder. When authorities punished her, they did so not only to correct conduct, but to restore a shaken social script. That is one of the central tensions of this story. MOLL's life sits at the point where crime and performance become difficult to separate. The underworld understood theater. The theater understood notoriety. The crowd loved both. A purse cut in the street, a song performed in male attire, a public penance before a scandal-hungry audience. Each belonged to the same urban ecosystem, one in which people watched, judged, bought, sold, repeated, embellished, and consumed. Moll was not simply a criminal in a city of crime. She was a public event. It is tempting with a figure like this to lean too hard into romance, to make her bolder than the evidence allows, to give her speeches she never said, motives she never named, and triumphs she may never have claimed. The past invites invention where it withholds certainty. But this book is written in full awareness of that danger. The records surrounding Moll are rich, but they are not neutral. Many were produced by authorities intent on correction, by writers hungry for sales, or by observers already primed to see transgression as theater. She comes to us refracted through people who wanted to punish her, profit from her, or marvel at her. So this is also a book about distortion. It is about how a life becomes a legend and what is lost in that transformation. It is about the way women are narrated when they refuse obedience. It is about the unstable line between self-invention and public fabrication. It is about how crime, gender, class, and celebrity were already tangled together in early modern London long before the modern tabloids would pretend to invent that machinery. Moll's world may seem remote, with its roughs and stews and playhouses and sermonizing magistrates, but its instincts are not unfamiliar. We still know how society gawks at unruly women. We still know how notoriety can become livelihood. We still know how the crowd claims a woman and remakes her in its own image. That is why Moll matters. She matters not because she was flawless, nor because she was safely admirable, but because she was difficult. Because she does not stay in the neat moral categories history prefers. Because she reminds us that the women most often remembered as caricatures were also participants in the hard, improvisational labor of survival. Because somewhere beneath the jeers, the pamphlets, the plays, the charges, the performances, and the punishments, there was a living woman navigating a brutal city with whatever means she possessed. To write about Mary Frith is to enter a world of noise. Jangling coins, market cries, theater songs, courtroom pronouncements, church rebukes, tavern laughter, gossip carried in the streets. It is also to listen for what that noise tries to drown out. Not innocence. Not simplification. But complexity. Moll Cutpurse has been called many things across the centuries. Thief. Roaring girl. Monster. Curiosity. Trickster. Findle. Sinner. Celebrity. This book begins from the belief that she was more interesting than any single label could contain. And perhaps that is why she endures. Because even now, centuries later, she will not sit still. Introduction. A woman in men's clothes. London liked its sinners legible. It liked its thieves rough-handed and male, its prostitutes visible, its rogues loud, its drunkards predictable, its poor submissive, its wives obedient, and its punishments public. Liked categories. Liked boundaries. Liked knowing where one kind of body ended and another began. A city so crowded, so unstable, so dependent on hierarchy could not afford too much ambiguity. Order, even when it was thin and theatrical, had to be maintained. Names had to mean something. Clothes had to mean something. Behavior had to mean something. To step outside one's appointed role was not merely to invite notice. It was to threaten the logic on which the whole social performance rested. Into that world stepped Mary Frith. She was not born legendary. She was born, as far as the record suggests, into an ordinary life in late 16th century London, and whatever her childhood contained has reached us only in fragments. Yet by the early 17th century she had become one of the most notorious women in the city, known widely by the nickname that would outlive her, Moll Cutpurse. It is a name with violence in it and wit and accusation. It reduces a person to an act, a reputation, a public identity sharpened for circulation. It is not a private name. It is the kind of name a city gives you when it intends to talk about you. And London talked. It talked in courts and taverns, in sermons and pamphlets, on stages and in markets. It talked in scandal, in ridicule, in fascination. Moll was discussed as a thief, a shameless woman, a disorderly body, a social provocation, and a figure of entertainment. She was remembered for wearing men's clothing, for smoking and drinking in public, for moving through taverns and playhouses with startling boldness, for associations with thieves and stolen goods, and for refusing the soft, contained, decorous femininity her culture demanded. She seems to have understood very early that public attention could be both danger and resource. Whether she sought fame or merely learned to survive it, she became inseparable from spectacle. That is part of what makes her so difficult to recover. We do not encounter Mary Frith in the archives as one encounters an ordinary subject. We do not meet her in calm domestic letters or intimate memoirs. We meet her in accusation, performance, and retelling. She appears where society had reason to notice her. In court records, in pamphlets designed to sell, in moralizing descriptions meant to condemn, in theatrical adaptations meant to entertain, in later accounts eager to preserve her strangeness. Every source brings us not only MOLL but someone else's need. A magistrate needs to correct. A playwright needs to captivate. A pamphleteer needs to shock. A moralist needs to warn. A city needs to make sense of a woman who would not stay within its script. So from the beginning, this book must proceed with care. MOLL CUTPURSE is one of those rare figures for whom there is enough evidence to build a life, but not enough to fully stabilize it. She is over-documented and underknown at the same time. There are many words about her, yet certainty slips away the closer one gets. This is not unusual with notorious women. Men who transgress are often recorded as actors. They did this, they stole that, they struck, cheated, lied, fled, gambled, drank, killed. Women who transgress, especially publicly, are more often rendered as spectacles. Their gestures are enlarged. Their clothing becomes argument. Their manner becomes scandal. Their bodies become texts others insist on reading aloud. A woman like MOLL was not simply accused of wrongdoing. She was made to signify. That process matters because it shaped how she has been remembered ever since. To later generations, she became many things at once. She became the roaring girl, a woman so unruly that ordinary language could not contain her. She became a cross-dressed curiosity, a prototype of rebellion, an underworld celebrity, a comic figure, a scandalous one, a proto-feminist icon, a moral wreck, a theatrical invention, a historical puzzle. Each age has found in her some reflection of its own anxieties or desires. The Victorians could treat her as vulgar. Modern readers are tempted to celebrate her as liberated. Popular history often turns her into a swaggering heroine too modern for her own century, while harsher accounts flatten her into vice with petticoats removed. Between those extremes lies a more interesting truth. Mary Frith was a woman making a life in a harsh city, using notoriety, audacity, social intelligence, and possibly criminal enterprise to carve out room for herself. That life unfolded in a London uniquely suited to producing figures like her. Early modern London was expanding rapidly. It was crowded, unequal, theatrical, and unstable. Wealth rubbed against desperation. Apprentices, merchants, laborers, sex workers, hawkers, servants, actors, gamblers, and thieves moved through the same spaces. Markets swelled. Taverns churned. Playhouses filled. The street itself was a stage, dense with negotiation, transaction, and risk. Surveillance was everywhere, but so were opportunities to slip through it. Goods moved quickly. Money changed hands fast. Reputation mattered, yet anonymity was possible in a crowd. A purse might be cut in a second. A lie might save a day's hunger. A woman without protection or wealth had few secure paths and many punishments waiting for missteps. Crime in such a city was not an aberration. It was woven into ordinary urban life. This was not the polished criminal underworld of later melodrama, with neat hierarchies and romantic codes. It was improvised, local, opportunistic, often brutal. Stolen goods circulated through brokers and fences. Victims sometimes paid to recover what had been taken from them. Informal economies thrived in the cracks between legality and necessity. Respectable men did business with disreputable people when it suited them. Women moved within these economies too, though their visibility in the record often depended on scandal. Theft, receiving stolen goods, swindling, sex work, street hustling, and information trading formed part of a blurred urban ecosystem in which the line between survival and criminality was not always as clean as the law pretended. MOLL seems to have flourished in precisely that blur. She was accused of purse cutting. She was linked to pickpocketing circles. She became associated with the recovery and resale of stolen goods. She appears to have occupied a role larger than that of a common street thief, moving instead toward brokerage, notoriety, and influence. She did not merely vanish into the criminal background of London. She made herself visible. That choice, or that adaptation, is central to understanding her. Many criminals survive by concealment. MOLL survived, at least in part, by turning herself into a figure no one could ignore. Yet visibility came at a cost. For a woman, clothing was not superficial. It was social language. Dress signaled rank, occupation, modesty, obedience, and gender. To wear male attire in public was not a harmless eccentricity. It unsettled the visual order of the city. It mocked authorities' confidence that the world could be read correctly at a glance. It raised questions that made people angry. What else might she be? What boundaries might she cross next? What does it mean if a woman refuses to look like a woman ought to look? Even those who encountered Moll as amusement often treated that amusement as edged with danger. She was entertaining because she was disruptive. She was disruptive because she made obvious how artificial many social codes really were. This book is therefore about more than one notorious woman. It is about a city's relationship with transgression. It is about the ways crime becomes theater and theater becomes evidence. It is about how public punishment attempts to restore meanings that public disorder has unsettled. It is about how women's notoriety functions differently from men's. It is about what happens when a woman's body becomes a site of public argument. It is about the underworld not as a separate realm beneath respectable society, but as something entangled with it, dependent on it, feeding off it, exposed by it, and in some cases quietly serving it. Most of all, it is about the production of legend, how a life is turned into a story, how that story grows, and how historians try to work backward through embellishment to reach something like a human being. That task requires resisting two temptations. The first is to sanitize Moll. She was not simply a brave eccentric unfairly misunderstood by a prudish society. The evidence strongly suggests real involvement in criminal activity and in the circulation of stolen goods. She was not a fictional rebel dropped into history to flatter modern ideas of resistance. She lived in a world where survival could demand ruthlessness, and she may well have been ruthless. The second temptation is to consume her exactly as her enemies did, as an object lesson in female corruption, vanity, and shamelessness. Those accounts tell us much, but not always what they intended. Their outrage is evidence. Their disgust reveals what they feared. Their insistence on her disorder helps expose the fragility of the order they claimed to defend. To read such sources well is not to accept them at face value, but to notice what they betray about the culture that produced them. In that sense, Moll is both subject and lens. Through her we can see how early modern London policed gender. Through her we can see how punishment operated as performance. Through her we can see how the city consumed scandal even while pretending to reject it. Through her we can trace the intersections of class, criminality, commerce, and celebrity. She is singular but not isolated. Her life opens outward into wider histories of women's work, street economies, theater culture, moral discipline, and urban survival. The title by which she is best remembered, Cutpurse, suggests skill, nimbleness, quickness of hand. But the sharper cut may have been symbolic. Moll sliced across categories others treated as fixed. She complicated the distinction between woman and man, criminal and performer, notoriety and power, punishment and publicity. She embarrassed authorities because she could not be easily reduced. Even when they arrested her, rebuked her, paraded her, or tried to shame her into compliance, they also helped make her famous. Every attempt to contain her enlarged her legend. That paradox sits at the center of this book. How does a city punish a woman without also advertising her? How does authority shame someone who can turn spectacle into capital? How does a culture devoted to reading surfaces respond to a person who deliberately scrambles those surfaces? And how do we, centuries later, write about such a figure without repeating either the moral panic or the romance? A city where survival demanded improvisation, where respectability was both costume and shield, and where the difference between hunger and profit could hang on a quick hand, a loud voice, a useful lie, or a face that knew how to look unremarkable in a crowd. It was a city always in motion. Goods arrived by river and road. Apprentices jostled through the streets on errands. Hawkers cried their wares. Carts jammed lanes already narrowed by refuse, animals, and human traffic. Bells marked the hours with the confidence of authority, but beneath those bell tones spread a less orderly rhythm. Bargaining, cursing, laughter, accusation, song, preaching, debt, gossip, and alarm. London was not quiet enough for innocence. It was not stable enough for simplicity. To live there was to inhabit a place where disorder was routine, even as authorities insisted that order prevailed. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the city had grown rapidly and growth brought pressure. People poured into London from the countryside and from smaller towns, chasing work, opportunity, refuge, or reinvention. Some found it. Many did not. The city rewarded energy, cunning, adaptability, and luck. It could enrich a merchant, feed a craftsman, elevate an actor, employ a servant, or make a courtier glitter. But it could also grind a laborer into debt, expose a woman to exploitation, press a child into service, and leave the poor to scramble among the dangerous edges of urban life. Prosperity and desperation did not occupy separate worlds. They brushed shoulders daily. That nearness mattered. Crime in London was not committed in some remote underworld disconnected from ordinary life. It emerged from the same streets respectable people used, the same markets where they shopped, the same taverns where they drank, the same parishes where they prayed, the same theaters where they went to be amused. Theft happened where people gathered. Fraud grew where money moved. Receiving stolen goods depended on neighbors, brokers, shopkeepers, servants, and customers. Violence flared in close quarters. The city's density made all of this possible. Crowds could conceal as easily as they could witness. Anonymity and exposure lived side by side. This was not an age in which the poor were imagined as innocent victims of circumstance by default. Poverty itself was treated with suspicion. The able-bodied poor might be accused of idleness, deceit, or vice. Begging was watched. Mobility was distrusted. Young men without masters and women without visible household governance could become objects of alarm. The city feared not only crime, but independence detached from hierarchy. To be unplaced was dangerous. To be unattached was threatening. London depended upon systems of rank obedience, household discipline, guild structure, parish oversight, and gendered decorum. Anyone who slipped beyond those systems might become not merely vulnerable but legible as a problem. For women, those pressures were sharper. A respectable woman was expected to belong somewhere. In a household under authority within visible moral boundaries. Her labor might be constant, but it was to be framed as dutiful. Her body was to be modest, her speech governed, her movement watched. Public space was not forbidden to women, but it was perilous terrain. Markets, churchyards, water stairs, shops, alehouses, and streets all required women to appear and move through the city. Yet the same city that depended on their visible labor also judged them for visibility itself. A woman too loud, too solitary, too mobile, too witty, too sexual, too quarrelsome, too adorned, too bold, too poor, or too unconcerned with convention could quickly attract suspicion. That suspicion did not require proof. It required only perception. The early modern city read women's bodies obsessively. Dress, posture, occupation, companions, speech, even the hour of movement could become evidence of character. A servant hurrying on an errand, a street seller calling customers, a widow negotiating business, a sex worker soliciting, a thief scanning a crowd, an actress near a playhouse, a woman simply walking alone. These figures might overlap in the eyes of observers eager to sort disorder from decency. The moral imagination of the time was both rigid and unstable. It claimed certainty while constantly fearing contamination. That fear made women especially vulnerable to being interpreted, accused, or transformed into examples. In such a city, criminality and survival were not always easy to separate. Theft could be opportunistic, but it could also be practical. A servant might steal linen from a mistress. A market woman might cheat on measures. A laborer might pocket tools. A child might snatch food. A woman with no secure income might drift toward sex work, petty fraud, receiving stolen goods, or other forms of illicit exchange that rested not on villainous grandeur but on daily need. None of this should be romanticized. The city's poor stole from one another as well as from the rich. Violence could be ugly and deceit cruel. But the law's language of wickedness often concealed the harder fact that urban life itself generated conditions in which illegality became part of the economy of survival. That economy relied on networks. A purse cut from a belt was only useful if its contents could be spent, hidden, or sold. Cloth taken from a stall required a buyer. Silver plate stolen from a household needed someone willing to melt it, hold it, pawn it, or broker its return. Information mattered. So did trust or something close to it. Criminal life in London was rarely solitary. It depended on accomplices, handlers, lookouts, receivers, and those whose respectability provided cover. One could not thrive for long on theft alone without entering wider systems of exchange. The underworld, insofar as such a word applies, was less a shadow kingdom beneath society than a set of parasitic and symbiotic relationships woven into it. Servants knew household routines. Apprentices knew shop layouts. Tavern keepers heard loose talk. Women who sold goods on the street learned who was desperate, who was drunk, who was vain, and who could be distracted. Children moved through spaces adults overlooked. Noisy, crowded London produced expertise in human weakness. Some used that expertise lawfully. Some did not. Pickpocketing, or cutpursing, was one of the city's most feared and familiar crimes because it exploited the very thing London generated in abundance: closeness. The crowded market, the procession, the playhouse entrance, the church gathering, the packed lane, all created opportunity. A body brushed yours. A hand found the strings of your purse. A small blade nicked the fastening. The loss was discovered only when the thief had already dissolved into surrounding movement. It was a crime of skill, nerve, and timing. It required not brute force but practiced attention. One needed to read bodies, judge distraction, exploit congestion, and vanish quickly. The success of the act depended on the ordinary chaos of city life. That chaos had its own social texture. People pressed close not because they sought intimacy, but because space itself was contested. Streets were narrow and often filthy. Waste was thrown where it should not have been. Animals moved among people. Trades spilled outward from shops. River traffic brought labor and noise near the water. The city smelled of smoke, sewage, beer, sweat, leather, fish, and horse. Disease haunted it. Fire haunted it. Hunger haunted it. But so did novelty, amusement, possibility, and reinvention. London repelled and attracted at once. It was, crucially, a theatrical city. The theaters were not a minor ornament of urban life. They were among its defining spectacles. Crowds gathered not only to trade, witness punishments, or hear sermons, but to watch performance. The rise of commercial theater transformed public culture, creating new spaces in which language, costume, gesture, class imitation, seduction, wit, violence, and disguise could be staged, sold, and circulated. The boundary between actor and rogue, costume and fraud, scripted role and social performance was never entirely secure. Playhouses drew apprentices, gentlemen, laborers, sex workers, thieves, and curious spectators. They offered delight and alarm in equal measure to moralists, who feared the pleasures of imitation almost as much as the disorder of crowds. Performance was not limited to the stage. The entire city performed. Punishments were performed. Public penance relied on spectatorship. Authority announced itself through ceremony, processions, and visible correction. Markets were scenes of display. Taverns encouraged role-playing and bravado. Even respectability was something one had to enact convincingly, through dress, speech, household order, religious observance, and reputation. In a city so alert to surfaces, mastery of surface could become power. One might deceive. One might seduce. One might distract. One might unsettle by looking wrong in a world that insisted appearance revealed truth. This mattered particularly in relation to gender. The distinction between male and female was not merely biological in the social imagination of the time. It was moral, behavioral, hierarchical, and sartorial. Clothing was read as evidence. To dress above one's station suggested vanity or fraud. To blur masculine and feminine attire suggested something far more provocative: disobedience to the natural and social order itself. A woman in men's clothing was not simply eccentric. She was an affront to legibility. She made visible the possibility that gender itself relied on repetition, costume, and enforcement. Authorities reacted fiercely to that possibility not because it was rare, but because it exposed how much their confidence depended on display. Long before Mary Frith became infamous for male attire, London was already primed to fear and consume such deviance. The city loved scandal nearly as much as it loved condemning scandal. It fed on stories of unruly women's sexual impropriety, imposture, theft, swagger, and shamelessness. Pamphlets flourished by feeding moral appetite through titillation disguised as warning. A notorious woman could be turned into a lesson for public good while simultaneously serving as public entertainment. The contradiction mattered less than the sale. That, too, was part of the city's economy. Information moved like money. Rumor, accusation, wit, and notoriety circulated rapidly. A name could become famous not because it belonged to power but because it belonged to spectacle. Some people were made visible against their will. Others learned to exploit visibility. The crowd could destroy reputations, but it could also create them. In such a world, infamy and opportunity could become entangled. A woman bold enough to withstand attention might discover that fear, fascination, and scandal had practical uses. Yet no one, however audacious, moved through London untouched by punishment. The legal structures of the city were broad, overlapping, and often severe. Petty offenders might be whipped, imprisoned, fined, or shamed. Bridewell and other correctional institutions sought to discipline the disorderly poor through labor and humiliation. Public penance exposed bodies to communal judgment. Repeat offenders faced harsher consequences. Transportation was not yet the dominant solution it would later become, but the criminal law already contained brutal possibilities, especially where property was concerned. The line between lesser and greater crime could be thin and mercy unpredictable. The law spoke grandly of order while operating unevenly, shaped by class, reputation, local custom, and circumstance. Women were not exempt from punishment, but their punishment often carried particular symbolic force. A disorderly man could be read as lawless. A disorderly woman threatened law, gender, and household discipline at once. She did not merely break a rule. She cast doubt on the structures meant to contain her. This is why authorities so often narrated female transgression as theatrical disorder. The aim was not only to correct the woman, but to reassure the public that meaning still held. Her body could be displayed, rebuked, and reinscribed with shame. Of course, shame did not always function as intended. Some people were broken by punishment. Others were hardened. Still others learned how publicity worked and discovered that notoriety could be converted into leverage. A person publicly corrected was also publicly advertised. In a city addicted to spectacle, disgrace could generate recognition, and recognition could become a resource. This was dangerous, unstable power, but power nonetheless. It could draw clients, accomplices, imitators, or protectors. It could also intensify scrutiny. To be known was risky. To be unknown could be fatal. London forced many of its inhabitants into improvisations between those conditions. All of this formed the world into which Mary Frith emerged. She did not invent urban disorder. She did not create London's criminal networks, its gender anxieties, or its appetite for spectacle. She inherited them. But she seems, from the surviving evidence, to have understood them with unusual clarity. Whatever else she was a creature of this city in the deepest sense. Alert to opportunity, unhumbled by scrutiny, drawn toward public visibility, and capable of moving through the unstable borderlands where crime, commerce, performance, and reputation met. To see her clearly, however, we must resist beginning with the legend already formed. We must not start with the swaggering caricature, the ready-made roaring girl of posterity. We must begin instead with conditions. With streets full of pressing bodies. With the moral obsession that made women legible as scandal. With the markets and taverns and playhouses where identities were tested and sold. With the city's hunger for stories. With the economies, legal and illegal, that fed upon one another. With the fact that London made certain lives possible by making them precarious. Some children were born into security. Others were born into contingency. The records do not yield us a soft, intimate portrait of Mary Frith's earliest years. Like many of the urban poor and middling sort, she emerges incompletely, glimpsed only when she moved close enough to the mechanisms of record-making to be noticed. But if her life later took shape amid accusation and notoriety, it was because London itself offered a set of lessons long before the courts and pamphlets named her. Watch the crowd. Read the room. Know where money is. Know where authority stands. Understand what people fear. Understand what they desire. Learn how appearance works. Learn how attention can destroy. Learn how it can also protect. These were the lessons of the city. And London was a ruthless teacher. The girl who would become MOLL CUTPURSE grew up in a place where categories were heavily policed and constantly broken, where morality was loudly staged and quietly compromised, where crowds concealed crime and created fame, where women were watched for signs of excess and punished for possessing too much public selfhood. The city that later condemned Mary Frith also trained her. It made her imaginable. It produced the conditions under which a woman could become notorious not simply by stealing, but by refusing to disappear. That refusal would, in time, make her unforgettable. But first there was the city. Crowded, anxious, theatrical, hungry. A place where every surface was read and misread, where the poor learned to improvise beneath the gaze of those who judged them, and where a quick hand could cut a purse while a quicker mind learned how to turn scandal into survival. Mary Frith belonged to London before London ever belonged to her legend. And the story of MOLL CUTPURSE begins, as so many urban legends do, in the crush of a city that both created and feared the people clever enough to live by its contradictions. Chapter 2. Mary Frith before MOLL. Childhood, family, and the making of a notorious woman. Legends are rarely born full-grown. They arrive in pieces. A stubborn child, a quarrelsome girl, a body that will not behave as expected, a refusal mistaken at first for mischief and only later understood as something larger and more dangerous. By the time the city knew her as MOLL CUTPURSE, bold, scandalous, unfeminine, criminal, theatrical, Mary Frith had already lived through years of ordinary shaping. Family, street life, discipline, observation, frustration, hunger, perhaps if not always literal then social. The slow education by which a young person learns what kind of place the world is, and what it will do to those who do not fit the pattern laid out for them. The difficulty, of course, is that the earliest Mary is the hardest to reach. Like many women of her period, and especially women later known primarily through notoriety, she does not come down to us in the soft, intimate record of self-description. There are no childhood diaries waiting politely in an archive, no mother's affectionate recollections, no bundle of family letters preserving her moods at 12 or her complaints at 15. What survives is partial, uneven, and already leaning towards spectacle. The adult criminal celebrity casts such a long shadow backward that even childhood becomes vulnerable to invention. Stories begin to cling. Anecdotes multiply. Character is rewritten in the light of what she later became. So one must proceed carefully. Mary Frith was born around 1584 in Elizabethan London, into a city that was already teaching hard lessons about gender, order, labor, and appearance. She was not born into the highest ranks of society, but neither was she a faceless waif conjured from pure destitution for dramatic convenience. She appears to have come from a family situated within the broad, precarious middling world of the city, respectable enough to be governed by its expectations, but not so powerful as to be insulated from its punishments. That social location matters. Extreme poverty can erase choices altogether. Great wealth can cushion defiance. It is often among the middling and lower middling ranks that social discipline bites hardest, because appearance matters so much and security depends so heavily on conformity. A daughter in such a household was expected to become useful. That usefulness was not abstract. It meant obedience, labor, modest presentation, and a future that folded her into familiar structures. She might assist within the home, prepare for service, learn domestic skills, help with trade or household management depending on the family's position, and above all understand that her body and conduct were not wholly her own. A son could be rough and still promising. A daughter who was rough risked becoming a warning. A boy's noise might be corrected as exuberance. A girl's boldness could be read as corruption in embryo. The same energy that might one day make a man seem enterprising could make a woman appear shameless. One suspects Mary learned this early. Not because we possess a clean record of childish rebellion, but because so much of her adult notoriety seems less like sudden transformation than long-developed habit. Women do not usually wake one morning into defiance. They practice it first in smaller rooms. In manner. In gait. In speech. In appetite. In their refusal to lower the eyes when told. In the precise angle at which they wear what they are given to wear. In their impatience with tasks meant to train not only the hands but the temperament. The future MOLL CUTPURSE did not emerge from nowhere. She was made in conflict, and conflict begins young. The city itself would have widened that conflict. A girl growing up in London absorbed more than household rules. She absorbed crowds, slang, trade, spectacle, danger, and the knowledge that beyond the door existed a world far larger and less orderly than pious instruction suggested. Streets carried examples everywhere. Women buying and selling. Men swaggering. Servants hurrying. Apprentices brawling. Beggars pleading. Players drawing crowds. Sharpers, thieves, laborers, constables, drunkards, watermen, preachers, prostitutes, and hawkers crossing paths in full public view. London exposed children to improvisation. It showed them the gap between prescription and reality. It demonstrated daily that respectable language about order sat beside obvious disorder and that many adults who demanded obedience lived by compromise, performance, or vice. A watchful child could learn a great deal from such contradictions. If Mary possessed a sharp eye, and all the later evidence suggests she did, then London itself was a kind of schooling. Not formal, not gentle, but practical. She would have learned how people carried money, which streets pressed close enough for jostling, which shops attracted display, where servants lingered, where gossip accumulated, which men were vain, which women were frightened, how authority announced itself and how ordinary people bent their bodies around it. She would have learned how clothing changed the way a person was received, how confidence could mimic legitimacy, how noise concealed some acts and drew attention to others. And she would have learned that gender was one of the city's most heavily guarded costumes. This is perhaps the first great key to understanding Mary Frith before she became famous. Her later cross-dressing was not important merely because it broke a rule. It was important because it exposed the rule's theatricality. To dress properly as a woman in early modern London was not simply to cover the body. It was to participate in an entire social script of rank, modesty, obedience, and recognizability. Female dress helped make women readable. It signaled decorum. It reassured observers that categories still held. A girl who seemed resistant to this instruction would already have been troubling before she ever put on male attire in public. Improper posture, an unfeminine stride, loud talk, disdain for soft manners, comfort in masculine company, impatience with sewing or domestic confinement. All of these could be treated as signs that something in her nature had tilted. Perhaps Mary was called willful. Perhaps impudent. Perhaps worse. Families possess their own systems of correction long before church or court intervene. A difficult daughter might be scolded, beaten, shamed, mocked, watched, or hurried toward marriage service, or some other arrangement meant to discipline by enclosure. Early modern parents did not imagine childhood in the softened sentimental terms later periods sometimes preferred. Correction was ordinary. Obedience was not a negotiable ideal. Yet there are always children for whom discipline does not produce submission, only strategy. Some become outwardly compliant and inwardly elusive. Others harden. Others begin to discover that notoriety inside a household can become a form of power. If one cannot be loved easily, one can at least become difficult to ignore. Mary seems destined for the latter category. One can imagine, carefully without pretending certainty, a young woman whose body language already disturbed expectation. Not simply disobedient but uncontained. Too much ease in public. Too little modest embarrassment. Too sharp a tongue. Too visible a pleasure in being seen. Such qualities do not make a criminal, but they do make someone especially vulnerable to being narrated as one. And once that narration begins, it gathers force. A girl becomes that sort. Her acts are interpreted in advance. What might be shrugged off in another becomes proof in her. If she resists, the resistance confirms the judgment. There are scattered traditions that Mary was sent out to be trained or disciplined and did not take kindly to it. Whether every later anecdote can be trusted is another matter. What matters more is the pattern those stories reveal. From an early stage she was imagined as a girl who would not be shaped into feminine obedience. Even if some details were embroidered, the persistence of that image tells us something about how she was remembered and why. She entered public legend not as a fallen innocent, but as someone whom observers preferred to see as unruly from the beginning, as though her later notoriety had been visible in childhood like a stain. Such retrospective moral logic is common. It comforts society to believe scandal was always detectable. That way no one need admit that respectable systems produce their own rebels. The more pressing question is not whether Mary was born bad, but what social uses her refusal served. A difficult girl allows a culture to rehearse its values. She can be pointed to as evidence that modesty must be taught harder, that fathers must govern better, that women must be watched more closely, that public space is dangerous, that vanity leads to ruin, that boldness in a girl is no small matter but the beginning of catastrophe. By the time Mary Frith was famous, she had already become exactly this sort of figure in the moral imagination. A woman whose body and behavior could be read as warning. Yet warning is never the whole story. There is another possibility, less comfortable and more compelling, that Mary's unruliness was also intelligence. Not academic intelligence in the narrow literate sense, though she may have possessed more verbal sharpness than many who judged her. Rather, a streetwise intelligence. Social intelligence. The capacity to read rooms, exploit inconsistencies, and understand instinctively that the world ran not on principles alone but on appetite, vanity, fear, and spectacle. A girl who learns early that she cannot win by sweetness may become exceptionally alert to other currencies. Presence. Nerve. Deflection. Humor. Insolence. Performance. Performance begins long before the stage. Children who feel out of place often experiment with selfhood in visible ways. They exaggerate. They provoke. They try on roles not because identity is a game, but because identity is already being imposed upon them as one. For a girl in Mary's world, femininity was not offered as one style among many. It was demanded as the moral architecture of her future. To refuse that architecture even incompletely was to invite sanction, but also to discover possibilities. One learns what can be gotten away with. One learns how shock works. One learns that some people are angered not by harm but by confidence in the wrong body. This may be the truest early education Mary received, the education of reaction. A bold girl teaches herself by watching who flinches. The city would have provided no shortage of such lessons. London was a place of encounters, and encounters produce experimentation. A person could test versions of themselves against the crowd. Most passed unnoticed. Some did not. A girl who stepped even slightly outside convention could feel the pressure immediately. Glances, mockery, rebuke, laughter, curiosity, insult. But she might also feel something else. Attention. Attention can wound, but it can also intoxicate, especially for those otherwise constrained. To be seen is dangerous. To be memorable is more dangerous still. Yet for certain temperaments, memorability becomes irresistible. One begins to suspect that long before Mary Frith became a public scandal, she had already grasped the volatile power of being looked at. That does not mean her youth was glamorous. Quite the opposite. To grow into difference under relentless scrutiny is exhausting. It hardens the nerves and distorts the affections. It may leave a person defensive, theatrical, suspicious, craving admiration while scorning those who bestow it. A girl repeatedly told she is wrong may either break or convert judgment into armor. Mary, by all appearances, converted. There is also the question of labor, which no account of her formation should ignore. Whatever later fame attached to her, she lived in a city where work structured identity. Women worked constantly, whether in homes, in service, in petty trade, in the informal economy, or in combinations of all of these. If Mary resisted conventional female conduct, she still had to live. Survival was not an abstract drama but a material problem. The path toward theft, brokerage, public notoriety, or criminal association was not paved simply by temperament. It was made possible by economic reality. A young woman without easy conformity or protected status would have fewer respectable options. The city's margins were full of women improvising livelihoods under judgment. Some sold goods. Some sold labor. Some sold information. Some sold sex. Some received stolen property. Some cultivated protectors. Some combined several methods. The border between survival and criminality was narrow and frequently crossed. Mary's later link to stolen goods and underworld networks suggests not random descent into vice but adaptation to available urban economies. She may have begun at the edges, learning who traded in what, who could be trusted, who could be cheated, and where women with wit and nerve could insert themselves into male systems without ever being fully accepted by them. Such knowledge does not appear overnight. It accrues. Through observation. Through failure. Through acquaintances. Through being underestimated. And to be underestimated as a woman could itself become an advantage. A loud or notorious woman attracts moral outrage, but a young woman on the threshold of notoriety may attract something else first. Dismissal. She is silly, people say. Improper. Ridiculous. Merely troublesome. Meanwhile, she is watching, learning, and calculating where power actually lies. In a society convinced women are naturally weaker, foolish, and more easily ruled, the woman who understands those assumptions can use them as cover until the moment she no longer wishes to. At some point, the young Mary became the woman London would name Moll. Nicknames are rarely innocent. They announce that private life has become public property. Moll was common enough as a familiar name for Mary, but Cutpurse, is an accusation sharpened into identity. Whether the name emerged from proven theft, widespread rumor, or the city's delight in attaching dramatic labels, it indicates that by then she was no longer merely a difficult woman in a difficult city. She had become legible as a type: criminal, disorderly, memorable. The name did what all urban nicknames do. It simplified and amplified. It turned a person into a story people could pass along. But before the name was fixed, before the courts and pamphlets helped make it famous, there had already been years of manufacture. Not by printers but by the city itself. Household correction, gendered scrutiny, street education, economic pressure. The discovery that boldness shocks, that visibility can both endanger and empower, that other people's categories are often flimsy when tested hard enough. These were the materials from which Mary Frith was formed. She was not inevitable. No notorious woman ever is. Another life might have enclosed her differently. Another city might have silenced her sooner. Another family might have broken her nerve or redirected it into duller forms. But London, with its crowding, theatre, hypocrisy, and appetite for spectacle, did not erase such temperaments. It sharpened them. It taught them how to survive by reading performance everywhere and eventually by becoming performance themselves. The child Mary Frith remains partly hidden from us. That obscurity should not tempt us to fill every silence with melodrama. Yet it would be equally mistaken to imagine that the adult emerged without apprenticeship. Her apprenticeship was life in a city that punished women for visibility even as it rewarded those clever enough to wield it. Somewhere in those early years she learned not only that she was being watched, but that watching could be turned back upon the watcher. That was a dangerous lesson. It was the lesson of the street, the market, the tavern, the crowd. It was the lesson of a world in which clothing could govern judgment, in which shame could be staged, in which obedience was prized above truth, and in which a girl who would not submit was marked early for trouble. Mary Frith did not become notorious merely because she stole, if indeed she stole as often and as expertly as later accounts insisted. She became notorious because she had already become difficult to place, and a woman difficult to place was one of the most unsettling figures early modern London could produce. The making of MOLL CUTPURSE began there. Not in a single crime, not in a single act of costume, not in one scandalous appearance, but in the long collision between a forceful temperament and a culture built on containment. The city had not yet fully named her, but it was already preparing to. Chapter 3. The streets teach quickly: theft, reputation, and the early underworld. There is a moment in the making of every notorious figure when private difficulty becomes public use. For Mary Frith, that transformation did not happen all at once. No trumpet announced it. No single witness paused in the street and declared that here at last was the woman who would become MOLL CUTPURSE. Rather, the process seems to have unfolded in the way most urban reputations do, through repetition, association, risk, and talk. A face seen in the wrong company. A name attached to an incident. A woman noticed too often where money changed hands and honesty thinned. A body already marked as unruly becoming further marked as useful. The city does not require certainty before it begins naming. It only requires pattern. And London was a city of patterns. By the time Mary Frith entered the public record as something more than an awkward or difficult woman, she had almost certainly spent years learning how the city's hidden transactions worked. Not hidden in the sense of invisible. London concealed very little entirely, but hidden in the sense that everyone knew such dealings existed while polite society pretended they did not touch respectable life. Theft, brokerage, vice, small frauds, receiving stolen goods, tactical lies, strategic silences, cash paid to avoid official trouble. These were not foreign intrusions into urban society. They were among its unofficial circulations. Goods moved lawfully through the city in great abundance, and where goods moved, they also leaked. A growing city produced overflow. Markets teemed with cloth, household wares, foodstuffs, trinkets, tools, ribbons, second-hand garments, plate, cups, tobacco, knives, gloves, purses, and every portable object that could be desired, displayed, stolen, or resold. Households contained goods worth taking and servants who knew where they were kept. Shops displayed temptation within reach of quick fingers. Taverns loosened caution. Playhouses brought together vanity, leisure, confusion, and crowds. Water stairs, alleys, lanes, and market edges connected the respectable and the illicit through nothing more dramatic than regular human movement. The city was not neatly divided into honest and dishonest quarters. Illegality threaded through ordinary space. For a woman with keen observation and weak attachment to convention, this world offered both danger and instruction. Mary Frith did not have to descend into some theatrical abyss called the underworld. She only had to notice what ordinary London already revealed. A merchant cheated on measure. A servant sold scraps from the household. A poor woman passed on goods of uncertain origin with a shrug. A customer bought stolen cloth cheaply and asked no questions because economy mattered more than principle. A broker arranged the return of property for a fee. A constable looked the other way for reasons of convenience, influence, or exhaustion. Respectability was strict in language and elastic in practice. Anyone paying attention could see it. Theft, especially petty theft, thrived on that elasticity. Pickpocketing was feared because it dramatized urban vulnerability. It could happen to anyone in a crowd. It mocked status. It turned proximity into peril. It required no weapon grander than a small blade or quick fingers and no setting more sinister than a busy thoroughfare. The victim's body became the site of betrayal. The thief's body vanished back into the mass. In a city dependent on closeness, it was a crime perfectly suited to its environment. Yet pickpocketing was only one node in a wider chain. What happened after the purse was cut mattered as much as the act itself. Coins could be spent quickly. Small valuables could be traded. Information gleaned from a stolen letter might be sold. Decorative items could be broken down or passed along. The theft was the opening move, not the whole game. This is where criminal reputation began to overlap with criminal utility. A person who cut purses was dangerous. A person who knew where stolen things could be turned into money was valuable. A person who could move between worlds, street and tavern, rogue and customer, thief and victim, was more valuable still. Such figures were not necessarily kings or queens of any organized realm. They were intermediaries, fixers, brokers, faces known in the right places. People whose usefulness depended on knowing how to translate risk into profit. Mary Frith's later career strongly suggests that she learned this lesson early. Whether she began as a direct thief, an accomplice, a distraction, a receiver, or some combination of roles, the surviving image of her makes little sense unless she had become adept at navigating these fluid urban economies. Her nickname itself points toward cutpursing, but nicknames can exaggerate. The more interesting question is not whether she cut every purse later attributed to her, but how she became attached to the symbolic power of that crime. To be called cutpurse was to be publicly associated with nimbleness, audacity, and urban predation. It meant the city had begun to imagine her not merely as disorderly, but as actively dangerous to property and by extension to social trust. Property, after all, mattered enormously. In early modern England, crimes against property carried moral and legal weight out of proportion to the size of some individual losses because property was bound up with order itself. To steal was not only to take, it was to challenge the visible distribution of rights and authority. That is one reason why women thieves could generate so much fascination. Female criminality unsettled two systems at once. It threatened property and violated gendered expectations of behavior. A man who stole might be condemned as lawless. A woman who stole seemed to the moral imagination doubly perverse, unruly in deed and unnatural in station. That double charge made women memorable. It also made them narratively profitable. Pamphlets, gossip, court tales, and street talk all preferred a woman thief with distinguishing features. Bold speech, impudent dress, masculine habits, a taste for visibility, a body already marked by social suspicion. A quiet female receiver of stolen linen might live and die without entering legend. A woman like Mary Frith could not. The city was far too eager to make an example of her, and examples have a way of becoming entertainment. But before entertainment came apprenticeship. Urban criminal life demanded more than nerve. It required reading people quickly and correctly. Who was carrying money? Who was distracted by display? Who feared embarrassment enough to settle privately? Who would go to law and who would rather pay for quiet recovery? Which goods were easiest to move? Which buyers asked no questions? Which officers could be avoided? Which houses were porous through servants? Which taverns collected useful rumors? A person who excelled in such worlds developed a form of intelligence often ignored by those who later condemned them. Not virtue certainly. Not innocence. But intelligence nonetheless. Practical, situational, unsentimental. Mary Frith appears to have possessed it in abundance. One can imagine her moving through the city not yet as a full-grown legend, but as a woman increasingly aware of what made others vulnerable. She would have seen vanity in those who dressed richly and inattentively. She would have noticed the carelessness of men who underestimated women, the impatience of merchants, the gossip of servants, the way crowds thickened at certain corners, the way excitement near a playhouse or market loosened vigilance. A less forceful woman might have found the city threatening and withdrawn. Mary seems instead to have read it as a field of usable knowledge. That knowledge came with company. No one builds urban notoriety alone. Even the boldest individual depends on circles of association. Casual allies, drinking companions, thieves, brokers, receivers, performers, informants, lovers, protectors, rivals, and those curious souls who hover at the edge of criminal life while keeping one foot in respectability. Mary's increasing visibility almost certainly drew her into such circles. The city's illicit economies were social before they were systematic. Trust was fragile, often temporary but still necessary. Goods had to be passed. Warnings had to be shared. Opportunities had to be recognized collectively. A woman able to speak boldly, handle herself in mixed company, and project useful confidence could acquire influence even without formal power. Here the boundaries between criminality and performance grow difficult to separate. A successful cutpurse depended on distraction. A successful broker depended on presentation. A notorious woman depended on stagecraft whether or not she stood on an actual stage. She had to know how to command attention, redirect suspicion, cultivate a certain aura, and survive being remembered. Mary's later public life suggests not accidental notoriety, but fluency in these arts. She did not merely commit or associate with crime. She learned how crime could be narrated and how narration could become part of her power. This was dangerous work because narration rarely belonged entirely to the criminal. The city told stories too, and once it began telling hers, Mary's image could no longer be managed only by herself. Rumor sharpened. Repetition simplified. People attached incidents to the most memorable name available. A woman already known for unfeminine conduct could quickly become the assumed culprit in the public imagination. She did not need to be present at every act to become symbolically responsible for a whole type of act. Reputation once formed attracts attribution. The notorious become containers for the city's anxieties. There is a cruelty in this but also a strange kind of opportunity. A feared reputation can shield as well as expose. People hesitate before crossing someone believed capable of retaliation or influence. Clients seek out those whose notoriety suggests effectiveness. Accomplices prefer a known quantity. Victims may bargain privately rather than risk public embarrassment. Fame of the wrong sort can become currency. The price is constant scrutiny, but some temperaments discover they would rather be watched than ignored. Mary Frith seems to have been one of them. At some stage, likely in these years before full celebrity, she ceased being merely a woman among urban disorder and became one of its recognizable faces. That transformation would not have made life easier. The city could use a notorious woman, but it could also turn on her violently. Public morality fed on figures like Mary even as the law sought to discipline them. The same crowd that enjoyed scandal could demand punishment. The same men who laughed at a swaggering woman in one setting could denounce her as dangerous in another. To live visibly on the edge of legality was to exist under unstable terms. One survived by reading moods, alliances, and opportunities with relentless precision. This may help explain why Mary's legend later contains such a fusion of hardness and theatricality. Sentiment was not a useful tool in these environments. Wit was. Insolence was. Timing was. Self-invention was. If the city meant to talk about her regardless, she may have concluded it was better to shape the talk than to shrink from it. Better to become unmistakable than pitiable. Better to lean into notoriety than be crushed by shame. Better, perhaps, to let the name MOLL CUTPURSE harden around her and then wear it as if she had chosen it. Such acts of self-possession are never pure. They are forms of defense as much as ambition. The early modern city was not kind to women who lived outside stable household protection. Every move exposed them to ridicule, exploitation, and legal danger. Those who survived did so by improvising armor from whatever materials lay near at hand. For some, that armor was piety. For others, marriage. For others, invisibility. Mary's armor appears to have been boldness and spectacle. She learned to make the very traits used against her into instruments of survival. If she was called shameless, she could act shamelessly enough to make shame ineffective. If she was watched, she could turn the watchfulness into a kind of unwilling audience. If she was already suspected, she could inhabit suspicion so completely that it became identity. This is not heroism. It is adaptation. And adaptation has moral costs. To thrive within criminal or semi-criminal networks required a capacity to treat others instrumentally. One needed to exploit weakness, conceal truth, and sometimes profit from the losses of people no less vulnerable than oneself. The poor robbed the poor often enough. Women could be ruthless. Victims were not all wealthy fools. A romantic account of Mary's rise would flatten the real harms woven through urban theft and brokerage. Yet moral clarity should not blind us to context. Those who lived nearest the edge of precariousness rarely had the luxury of clean hands. The city itself was organized around uneven power, and many of its most respectable inhabitants profited from systems no less cruel simply because they were legal. What Mary did or was alleged to do brought that cruelty into sharper public form. A purse cut in the crowd is vivid. A stolen item brokered back to its owner is insulting. A woman who participates in such acts while dressing and behaving in ways already deemed improper becomes irresistible as a symbol of social decay. That is why her legend thickened. She gave moralists too much to work with: gender disorder, public boldness, criminal association, theatricality, and the whiff of urban contagion. She seemed to prove everything authorities wished to warn against. But she also proved something else, though few would have admitted it plainly: that the city's systems were porous. That men could be fooled. That property could be detached from ownership in seconds. That reputation could be weaponized. That a woman outside ordinary feminine discipline could acquire agency, however unstable, through the very circuits society claimed to despise. Mary's rise revealed weakness in the social body. No wonder the city both feared and fed on her. By now, the outlines of the future mall are beginning to sharpen. Not yet the fully public spectacle standing in male attire before a scandalized audience. Not yet the celebrated and condemned roaring girl of cultural memory, but already something potent. A woman trained by the streets, fluent in ambiguity, growing into notoriety through theft, association, and the practical arts of urban survival. The streets teach quickly because they must. They teach who can be trusted and who only rented trust for an evening. They teach the price of carelessness. They teach that crowds conceal and expose at once. They teach that a woman's body will be read whether she wishes it or not, and that if she cannot stop the reading, she may as well learn to write part of the script herself. They teach that respectability is often only successful performance. They teach that shame is a weapon until it stops working. They teach that names once given can imprison, but can also be worn like armor. Mary Frith learned those lessons well. Soon the city would know her not merely as a woman suspected of theft or acquainted with dubious company, but as a public scandal in her own right. Soon crime and performance would bind so tightly around her that neither could be understood without the other. Soon her name would move beyond streets and markets into pamphlets, courts, theaters, and lasting memory. But before the stage, before the sermons, before the penalties that tried to make an example of her, there was this harder apprenticeship in the everyday theatre of London itself. The crowd, the purse, the gossip, the resale, the bargain, the dangerous thrill of being recognized. Mary Frith did not emerge from the underworld fully formed. She was taught by the city, and the city's lessons were sharp. Chapter 4. Becoming MOLL CUTPURSE. Clothing, scandal, and public defiance. A woman may steal and still pass under the right conditions as merely unfortunate, desperate, fallen, or morally weak. But a woman who steals, or is believed to steal, while also dressing against expectation, moving through public space with visible ease, and refusing the gestures of shame expected of her sex, becomes something else entirely. She becomes memorable. She becomes a problem larger than her crimes. She becomes useful to a culture hungry for examples. This was the transformation that turned Mary Frith into MOLL CUTPURSE. The name alone was not enough. London contained many thieves, and even notorious ones do not necessarily become legend. What made Mary endure was not criminality by itself, but the way criminality fused with spectacle. She did not merely enter the city's moral imagination as a woman connected to theft. She entered it as a woman whose body, dress, and bearing seemed to advertise defiance. In a society obsessed with reading surface as truth, Mary made surface unstable. She wore the wrong signals. She occupied space the wrong way. She invited the public eye, then refused to behave as though that I had any right to govern her. That was an offense beyond the reach of ordinary language. The early modern city relied heavily on visible codes. Clothing announced rank, trade, means, and gender. A cap, a jerkin, a gown, a petticoat, a sword, a ribbon, a cloak, the cut of a sleeve, the shape of a hat, all participated in the work of social interpretation. Sumptuary anxieties had long revealed how much governments feared the wrong person wearing the wrong thing. Dress was not simply decoration. It was discipline. To dress correctly was to reassure others that the social order remained legible. To dress incorrectly was to invite suspicion. To blur categories altogether was to threaten something deeper, the confidence that the world could be read at a glance. Mary Frith understood this, whether instinctively or consciously. Her reputation for wearing male clothing was not a trivial eccentricity, nor a decorative flourish later added to her story for dramatic convenience. It became central because it crystallized everything authorities and spectators found troubling about her. A woman in men's apparel did more than alter appearance. She disrupted expectation at the level of movement, authority, and posture. Clothing changes how a body is seen but also how it is inhabited. A woman dressed in masculine fashion did not merely look improper. She could seem to claim masculine liberties, ease in public, verbal boldness, wider physical movement, less visible vulnerability, a different relationship to fear itself. That possibility made people angry. The anger, tellingly, often exceeded the practical harm involved. There were crimes far more violent than improper dress. There were men whose conduct caused more material damage than anything Mary was accused of in these years. Yet scandal gathered around her with unusual force because she appeared to violate the symbolic architecture of gender. If women could wear masculine attire and still remain socially present, if they could occupy public space without the softening performance of modest femininity, then much of what society insisted was natural began to look suspiciously enforced. Mary did not have to articulate such ideas for her body to suggest them. Her clothing spoke before she did. And London listened with outrage, laughter, curiosity, and delight. Scandal depends upon audience. Without the crowd, transgression is merely private disobedience. Mary's great and dangerous gift was that she did not vanish into privacy. She moved through visible spaces. Streets, taverns, perhaps tobacco shops, possibly even theatrical environments, always in ways that encouraged notice. One suspects she understood by now that the city would talk about her whether she sought its permission or not. If she could not stop the talk, she might shape its tone. Better to be known as audacious than pitiable. Better to be notorious than merely shamed. Better to enter the crowd as a figure already prepared to withstand being looked at. This was public defiance. But public defiance is rarely pure spontaneity. It is a cultivated stance. To walk boldly in the wrong clothes takes more than impulse. It requires repetition. The first time may be an act of testing. The next strategy. After that it becomes part of identity, though never without risk. Every glance teaches. Every insult clarifies the boundary one is crossing. Every burst of attention reveals what disturbs people most. Mary seems to have learned quickly that what London feared was not simply illegality, but confidence housed in a female body and signaled through masculine codes. A meekly dressed woman accused of theft might still be read as fallen. Mary, by contrast, could be read as insolent, willful, unnatural, almost gleeful in disorder. This, of course, made her perfect material for moral panic. A culture anxious about women's behavior rarely settles for describing individual acts. It generalizes. It turns one body into a warning about all bodies. Thus Mary's defiance could be made to signify much more than itself. She became evidence in the eyes of moralists that loosened female conduct led towards social decay. Her clothing could be cited as proof that domestic government was failing, that women were abandoning modesty, that urban spaces bred corruption, that vice traveled in the company of spectacle. The detail of trousers or male fashion was never only a detail. It was a symbol upon which broader fears could be hung. And yet scandal contains fascination. That is its energy. The people who condemned women like Mary also consumed them eagerly. Pamphleteers needed material. Gossips needed stories. Crowds needed spectacle. Even those who spoke in outrage often did so with an attention bordering on appetite. This is one of the central hypocrisies of early modern urban culture. The same society that preached restraint fed itself on sensational disorder. A woman who broke rules publicly could be denounced and desired as an object of narrative at once. Her punishment would later be framed as moral necessity, but before punishment came circulation. He had to become known. Mary's notoriety flourished precisely in this contradiction. Her clothing did not merely set her apart from other female offenders. It made her narratable. One could describe it, reenact it in speech, exaggerate it, attach it to new rumors, use it to interpret everything else she did. A theft associated with Mary became more vivid because it belonged to the wrong woman in the wrong clothes. A tavern appearance became more scandalous because she was already a known transgressor. Her body acted as a magnet for attribution. Where she went, story followed. This may be the point at which Mary Frith ceased to be simply a woman living by nerve and adaptation and became a persona. Not yet in the modern sense of carefully managed public identity, but in the older, more dangerous sense of becoming a social character. MOLL CUTPURSE was a role the city placed upon her, but it was also one she learned to inhabit. She could not entirely control the terms of her representation, yet she seems to have grasped that if she carried herself with enough boldness, the representation could become armor rather than only accusation. Armor, however, does not prevent injury. It only changes how injury lands. The cost of public defiance was constant scrutiny. A woman already under suspicion did not enjoy the freedom her masculine dress might appear to suggest. She gained space in one register and lost it in another. She could command attention, but attention sharpened surveillance. She could unsettle men, but unsettled men were dangerous. She could turn shame outward, but institutions still possessed the power to discipline. Clothing might signal autonomy, yet it also drew the eye of churchmen, constables, magistrates, and moral entrepreneurs eager to restore the world's visible order by making an example of her. And examples must be staged. The authorities of Mary's London did not merely punish. They performed punishment. They needed deviant bodies to carry messages. A woman like Mary, whose offenses seemed to combine criminal association, public boldness, and gender disorder, offered an especially useful body for correction. She did not just need to be told privately to mend. She needed, in the moral logic of the time, to be displayed as evidence of what happened when women stepped too far beyond modesty and obedience. Public penance, correction houses, formal rebukes. These were not only legal consequences. They were acts of social theater meant to restore legibility where scandal had introduced ambiguity. But Mary's defiance complicated that theater. Ordinary shame depends on inward acceptance. It functions best when the punished person appears to recognize the justice of the rebuke. A bowed head reassures authority. Tears confirm moral narrative. Submission completes the scene. Mary, by contrast, seems to have carried into these encounters a destabilizing resistance. Even when punished, she remained too visible, too memorable, too difficult to reduce to passive warning. There are some offenders whose correction allows society to close the case. Mary's correction only enlarged her story. The effort to contain her became part of the mechanism that made her famous. That paradox would define much of her public life. It is easy, from a modern distance, to admire the image of defiant self-fashioning. There is something undeniably striking about a woman who moved through a rigidly gendered city in male clothing, answered scandal with visibility, and refused to become legible as a simple object of shame. But admiration should not flatten difficulty. Her defiance was not occurring in an abstract realm of liberated expression. It took place amid criminal suspicion, precarious economics, and the rough urban marketplace of notoriety. Boldness could be survival, yes, but it could also be coercive, manipulative, and bound up with real harm. Mary's power, such as it was, did not emerge from innocence. It emerged from hard urban adaptation. What distinguished her was not purity but force. She possessed, or at least projected, a form of self-possession deeply unsettling to her contemporaries. A woman was expected to be responsive to judgment, to take shape under supervision. Mary appeared to resist supervision altogether. Her dress announced that resistance. So did her gait, her presence, her very reputation for making public spaces her own. If respectable femininity required containment, she seemed committed to expansion. She took up room. She made herself visible. She treated the city not as something through which she must pass carefully, but as terrain she had as much right as any man to occupy. That may have been the deepest scandal of all. Not the garments themselves, but the claim they implied. A woman in male attire unsettled because she suggested that access to public confidence was perhaps not inherently masculine at all. That possibility could not be tolerated easily. It had to be translated into vice. Thus Mary's clothing was repeatedly read through the language of disorder, lewdness, criminality, and insolence. The culture could not afford to see such defiance merely as style. It had to interpret it as corruption. Only then could punishment appear not anxious but necessary. And still the city watched. One imagines the looks she drew: startled, amused, contemptuous, admiring, disgusted, intrigued. Apprentices nudging one another. Women disapproving publicly while remembering every detail. Men laughing too loudly to cover discomfort. Tavern whispers. Street-level myth-making. The word traveling faster each time. There goes Moll. There goes the woman in men's clothes. There goes the cutpurse. There goes the roaring girl before the phrase was fully fixed. Reputation, once joined to spectacle, reproduces itself almost without assistance. By now Mary Frith was no longer just learning from the streets. She was beginning to dominate them symbolically. Not as queen of some neatly ordered criminal realm, but as a public figure in whom the city's anxieties converged. Theft, boldness, clothing, sexuality, rumor, class tension, female visibility, theatricality, all found a meeting point in her. That is why she remains so compelling. She did not merely break one rule. She exposed the instability of several at once. This chapter in her life marks the real making of MOLL CUTPURSE. Not because the name first appeared on a particular day, nor because one exact costume completed her transformation, but because by this stage Mary had become inseparable from public defiance. Her clothes were no longer simply garments. They were arguments. Her body was no longer merely her own. It had become a contested surface onto which the city projected fear and fascination. Her reputation was no longer a string of incidents. It was a narrative gathering force. Soon the institutions of church and law would move more visibly against her. Soon the records would catch her more clearly in the act of being judged, corrected, and turned into a lesson. Soon theater itself would seize upon her image and help make her immortal in ways no constable could have predicted. But before official intervention fully enclosed her, there was this stage of electric public emergence. The bold woman in the wrong clothes walking through London as though the city's rules were only one version of reality and not the only one. It is difficult to overstate how provocative that must have seemed. Mary Frith was becoming famous not in spite of scandal but through it. She had discovered, whether by instinct or experience, that once shame loses its power to govern, the social order must reach for harsher tools. Yet every harsher tool risked making her larger. That was the trap she set simply by refusing to disappear. Each rebuke made her more visible. Each act of visible defiance deepened the myth. Each attempt to force her back into womanly legibility only confirmed that she had, somehow, stepped beyond the limits prescribed for her. In a world ruled by surfaces, Mary Frith made surface revolt. And London could not stop looking. Chapter 5. Church, Court, and Correction. Punishing a public woman. Every society reveals itself most clearly in the way it punishes those who embarrass it. London could tolerate vice more easily than it could tolerate visible defiance. It could absorb theft, drunkenness, lying, cheating, and covert sexual misconduct into the daily grime of city life. It could grumble, arrest, fine, whip, and move on. But a woman who made transgression public, who seemed to wear insolence openly, who moved through the city in masculine dress, who invited scandal by refusing to shrink from it, demanded something more deliberate. She had to be corrected not only for what she had done but for what she represented. She had to be made readable again. That was the work of church, court, and correction house. For Mary Frith, punishment was never likely to remain private. She had become too visible for that. Her offenses, or alleged offenses, belonged to a category that early modern authority treated as especially contagious. Not merely wrongdoing but disorder performed before witnesses. She was a woman attached to theft, rumor, masculine clothing, bold public conduct, and the suspicion of shamelessness. Such a figure could not simply be warned behind closed doors and left to repair herself quietly. Quiet repair would not answer the larger problem. The larger problem was that other people had seen her. Other people had talked. Other people might imagine from her example that authority could be mocked or circumvented. So authority answered in the only language it trusted fully: spectacle. It is easy from a modern distance to divide institutions into separate moral worlds. Church as spiritual, court as legal, correction house as carceral. In practice, they overlapped in purpose. All were engaged in different registers in the policing of conduct and the restoration of legibility. The church spoke of sin, the court of offense, the correction house of discipline, but beneath these vocabularies lay a common anxiety about bodies that would not stay within prescribed order. Women drew particular scrutiny because they were imagined not merely as individual moral agents but as bearers of household and social stability. A disorderly woman could be read as a sign that authority had weakened at its roots. Mary Frith made that weakness visible. By the early years of the 17th century, she was already notorious enough to attract formal intervention. The surviving record shows not only that authorities knew of her, but that they knew how to frame her. She was not treated simply as one more petty offender among many. She was named, observed, and rebuked in ways that reveal how closely public conduct and public meaning had fused around her. Her appearance, speech, dress, and theatrical associations mattered because they made her offense larger than the sum of any individual act. That is why punishment became narrative. Authorities do not merely restrain, they explain. They must tell the public what the offense signifies, what order has been threatened, and what lesson the punishment restores. In Mary's case, the lesson required particular force because the threat was symbolic as much as practical. A purse might be stolen and replaced. A fine might be paid. But what was to be done with a woman whose very public presentation unsettled the system of signs by which London claimed to know itself? What was to be done with a woman who dressed as a man, appeared in public without the visible modesty expected of her sex, and seemed to transform correction into advertisement? The answer, at least initially, was to expose her. Public penance was one of the most powerful tools available for such exposure because it joined humiliation, religious authority, and spectatorship. It did not merely punish the body, it staged moral interpretation upon it. The offender appeared before the public not as an ambiguous person but as a text authority claimed to read correctly. Clothing, posture, confession, placement, and witness all mattered. Penance translated disorder into a ritual of restoration. It said, "This person erred, this institution judged, this public saw, this shame returned meaning to where it had been disturbed." But penance depended on submission. It worked best when the offender visibly accepted the terms of judgment. The ideal scene was not only punitive but emotionally legible. Contrition, lowered eyes, acknowledgement of fault. A body performing repentance reassured society that internal order might be rebuilt. Mary Frith complicated this reassurance. Even in disgrace, she was too memorable, too singular, too saturated with previous scandal to dissolve neatly into a generic tableau of female shame. Her very presence threatened to leak beyond the intended script. A notorious woman on display is still a notorious woman. Spectacle cannot always be controlled once released. This is the paradox at the center of her punishment. The more institutions tried to make an example of Mary, the more they helped stabilize her legend. Consider what authorities were up against. Here was a woman already spoken of in connection with criminal circles: masculine dress, public singing, tobacco, taverns, and bold self-presentation. She had become a figure in whom multiple anxieties converged: urban disorder, female visibility, sexual suspicion, theatricality, class unease, and criminality. Each official act against her therefore carried two meanings at once. It asserted institutional power, yes. But it also announced her importance. People do not stage elaborate correction for the forgettable. Her punishment made her worth looking at. This was especially true in relation to the church. Religious authorities were deeply invested in visible moral order. To see a woman publicly refuse the comportment proper to her sex was not merely indecorous. It seemed spiritually dangerous. Dress was not neutral. Gesture was not neutral. Public speech was not neutral. A woman in male attire who occupied urban space boldly could be described not just as unruly but as impious, lewd, or unnatural, because moral and social categories bled into one another. To correct such a woman was therefore a sacred duty as much as a civic one. Yet sacred duty did not erase curiosity. One of the striking features of early modern moral culture is how often the language of condemnation is inseparable from attention verging on fascination. Authorities recorded what offended them in vivid detail. The very act of denouncing impropriety helped circulate it. This is true in Mary's case as well. The details that survive, her male clothing, her public performance, her immodest speech, her visible refusal of feminine restraint, endure because institutions and observers found them worth describing. Their outrage preserved her. Without that outrage, much of her life might have vanished into urban oblivion. The court, meanwhile, operated in a different but related register. Courts converted rumor into charge, charge into hearing, and hearing into socially authorized truth, even when the underlying facts remained partial or uncertain. For women like Mary, appearance in court was never merely about legal disposition. It was also about classification. The court named what sort of person one was: disorderly woman, thief, vagrant, scandalous offender. The legal system gave sharper edges to public identity, and once sharpened, those edges cut both ways. A legal rebuke could harm reputation permanently, but for someone already notorious it could also deepen notoriety into a more durable kind of fame. Mary seems to have understood this, or at least to have lived as though she did. There is a difference between a person crushed by official shame and one who carries it as if it were already expected. Mary belonged to the second category. That did not make her invulnerable. Bridewell, public penance, examination, and repeated arrest were all serious intrusions backed by coercive power. But she appears in the historical imagination not as someone subdued into obscurity, but as someone who somehow remained stubbornly herself through correction. One senses in the record the frustration of institutions confronting a woman who would not resolve into their preferred ending. Bridewell is central here not only as a place but as an idea. Correction houses such as Bridewell were built on a logic of discipline through confinement, labor, and moral reform. They were meant to take disorderly bodies and subject them to routine, surveillance, toil, and humiliation until conduct became governable. These institutions targeted those thought idle, sexually suspect, poor, stubborn, or otherwise disruptive to social order. Women sent there were not merely criminals in the narrow sense. They were often treated as failures of discipline. Bridewell addressed conduct society found embarrassing precisely because it occupied the blurry border between vice and misgovernment. Mary fit that logic almost too perfectly. A woman publicly associated with lewd speech, male dress, and scandalous visibility could be framed as exactly the sort of person correction houses existed to break into order. Yet the deeper problem was that Mary's disorder was not invisible and private. It was socially expressive. She had become a public sign. Bridewell might punish the body, but what of the sign? Labor might exhaust, confinement might restrict, but neither necessarily erased narrative. Once a woman becomes a story, correction must contend not only with the offender but with the audience. And Mary always had an audience. Even when dragged before authority, she was still being watched. By officials, by spectators, by chroniclers, by enemies, by those who envied boldness, by those secretly thrilled by it. A public woman is never alone in her punishment. This fact intensified the stakes of every formal intervention. Church and court were not simply contending with her conduct. They were contending with interpretation. Would the public see her as a cautionary example? As a grotesque? As entertainment? As proof of female corruption? As proof that institutions still controlled deviance? Or, more dangerously, as someone who survived all attempts to contain her? That last possibility helps explain the severity of the moral tone directed at her. When authority feels secure, it often punishes with matter-of-fact confidence. When it feels mocked, its language tends to swell. It moralizes more intensely, describes more vividly, insists more loudly on the danger represented by the offender. Mary's case carries traces of such inflation. She was not merely wrong, she was threateningly wrong. Not merely unladylike, scandalously so. Not merely visible, offensively visible. Institutions often enlarge offenders rhetorically when trying to justify why so much energy is being spent upon them. Their intensity is evidence of their discomfort. And they had reason to be uncomfortable. Mary Frith revealed the limits of coercion in a spectacle-driven city. She could be arrested, rebuked, confined, examined, and displayed, yet still emerge larger in reputation than before. Public punishment depended on transforming transgression into warning, but Mary had already learned how to occupy warning as identity. Shame loses force when the offender no longer agrees to be governed by it. That does not make punishment harmless. It makes it unstable. The audience may still take the lesson authority intends, but it may also take another lesson entirely. That this woman is extraordinary, that she is worth telling stories about, that she remains vivid even under correction. One should not romanticize this instability. Punishment hurt. Humiliation scarred. Correction houses were harsh. Public rebuke could wound materially and socially. Nor can one assume Mary always moved through these ordeals with theatrical detachment. She was a person, not a carved emblem of perpetual resistance. Fear, anger, exhaustion, and degradation would have been real. Still, the arc of her reputation suggests that whatever institutions meant to do to her, they failed to make her disappear into remorse. They disciplined her body without annihilating her public persona. Indeed, they may have made that persona more indestructible. This is where the chapter darkens most. Punishment of women like Mary was never only about acts. It was about restoring a world in which women could be read, placed, and governed according to accepted forms. Her masculine attire, public speech, and criminal associations were intolerable because they suggested that a woman might write herself into urban life without submitting to feminine modesty as the price of visibility. Church, court, and correction house responded by trying to rewrite her. They named her deviant, staged her shame, confined her unruliness, and used her body as a surface upon which authority reasserted itself. But Mary would not stay rewritten. That refusal did not mean victory. It meant persistence, survival, continued friction between the woman and the institutions that sought to define her. She emerged from punishment not cleansed into silence, but more deeply embedded in public memory. The same authorities who meant to turn her into a warning ended by helping transform her into something much harder to control, a cultural figure. This matters because it prepares the ground for what comes next. Mary Frith was no longer only a criminally tinged urban presence. She was becoming emblematic. Her punishments had given the city scenes to remember. Her body had been made official material. Her name had passed through institutions and come out more resonant. She now belonged not merely to street talk but to the wider machinery of representation. Once church and court have marked a person so visibly, the stage is not far behind. And the stage, unlike the law, does not care whether notoriety began in disgrace. It only cares that people will come to watch. By the time formal correction had done its work, Mary Frith had become one of those rare early modern women whose life could not be contained within ordinary moral categories. She had been examined by authority, humbled in public, confined by discipline, and still remained troublingly alive as a symbol. The city had tried to shame her back into legibility. Instead, it had given her larger outlines. Church, court, and correction had spoken. But London was not finished with her. Notes: this chapter draws on the well-documented outline of Mary Frith's punishments and public censure, including her appearance in male attire, her arrest and examination by church authorities, her committal to Bridewell, and her public penance at St. Paul's. The interpretive emphasis here is literary and historical rather than purely academic, but it is grounded in the known contours of her life. Chapter 6. Asterisk on the stage and in the street. The Roaring Girl and the Making of a Legend. Most criminals are pursued by the law. A very small number are pursued by the imagination. This is the point at which Mary Frith ceased to be merely notorious and became something far stranger. A living woman transformed into public entertainment while she was still alive to witness it. The city had already judged her, punished her, watched her, and circulated her name in gossip and scandal. But scandal alone does not make legend. Legend requires reproduction. It requires a wider stage. It requires the conversion of a difficult, inconvenient, flesh and blood woman into a figure that can move independently through speech, print, performance, and memory. For Mary Frith, that conversion came through the theatre. By the time The Roaring Girl appeared, London already knew how to consume notoriety. The city fed on spectacle in many forms: executions, sermons, public penance, duels, pageants, miraculous rumors, court scandals, criminal pamphlets, and the more everyday theater of street life itself. The commercial stage did not stand apart from these appetites. It refined them, shaped them, exaggerated them, and sold them back to the public with wit, poetry, and dramatic coherence. Playhouses were machines for turning social anxiety into profitable entertainment. They borrowed from the city's tensions and returned them in heightened form, allowing audiences to laugh, condemn, desire, fear, and recognize themselves all at once. Mary Frith was ideal material. She already existed in the public mind as an unstable mixture of criminality, gender defiance, gossip, and fascination. She wore male attire. She moved through the city with unsettling ease. She offended moralists and delighted the crowd. She was difficult to classify, and classification is precisely what drama loves to test. The theater thrives on bodies that cross boundaries, on characters who expose hypocrisy, on figures who make social order wobble just enough to be both pleasurable and alarming. Mary, or at least the idea of her, could not have arrived at a better time for theatrical use. Yet what the stage did to her was not simple imitation. It is tempting to imagine that the roaring girl merely captured Mary Frith as she really was and presented her to the public under a thin dramatic veil. But theater does not preserve, it transforms. The Mary who entered drama was filtered through market demands, narrative needs, comic structure, audience appetite, and the playwright's own sense of what could be made morally safe, theatrically compelling, and commercially successful. The result was not a documentary portrait, but a cultural version of MOLL, sharpened, stylized, rearranged, and made to carry meanings beyond the reach of any single human life. That is precisely what makes this moment so important. Once a notorious woman becomes a character, she can no longer be contained by biography alone. She begins to live in multiple forms at once. There is the woman in the street, subject to arrest, censure, fatigue, and bodily consequence. There is the woman in rumor, already enlarged by repetition. And now there is the woman on stage, given speeches, shape, timing, and dramatic purpose. These versions overlap, feed one another, and blur. Audiences who had heard of Mary Frith could watch a theatrical MOLL and feel they were seeing truth. Those who had not might leave the playhouse convinced they now knew her. The stage did not merely borrow her notoriety. It reorganized it. That reorganization is one of the central events of her life. A person can survive legal correction and still remain socially marginal. Theater changes that scale. To be dramatized in London's commercial culture was to enter wider circulation. It meant one had become useful not only as warning or scandal but as symbol. Mary Frith was no longer just a troublesome public woman. She had become a thing the culture could think with. Through her, audiences could contemplate questions that everyday life made difficult or dangerous to articulate plainly. What is a woman if she does not dress or behave as women are expected to? What happens when public boldness appears in the wrong body? Is defiance inherently corrupt, or does it reveal corruption elsewhere? How much of social order depends on costume? How much of virtue is simply performance? The theater could ask such questions because it always asked them indirectly. Drama delights in disguise, doubled meanings, mistaken identity, and unstable surfaces. A stage is the ideal place to test a society obsessed with appearances, because everything upon it is appearance made deliberate. Costume is not incidental, it is the medium. Gestures code. Speeches display. The actor becomes a body carrying meanings that the audience knows are constructed and yet responds to as if they were natural. In such an environment, Mary Frith's public life was almost pre-adapted for dramatic use. She had already turned clothing into provocation. She had already made bodily presentation a site of argument. She had already become famous for existing in ways that made social reading uncertain. The stage did not invent these qualities. It recognized in them its own logic. And then it softened, sharpened, and sold that logic. The MOLL of the Roaring Girl is not reducible to the historical Mary, though the two are inseparable in cultural memory. Dramatic MOLL is often more morally coherent than the real woman could ever have been allowed to be. Theater likes difficult figures, but it also likes intelligibility. A living woman who moved through underworld networks, public scandal, and institutional rebuke would have been full of contradiction, compromise, and moral murk. A stage character, by contrast, must function within a design structure. She may be outrageous, witty, and disruptive, but she also needs purpose, rhythm, and relation to the audience's sympathies. Thus the theatrical MOLL becomes something both safer and more enduring than Mary herself, an emblem of unruly female independence rendered speakable through art. This is the first great theft of her legend. The city had already taken Mary's life and made it public property. The theater went further. It took her instability and turned it into pattern. It transformed a woman who troubled social order into a figure who could expose that order's absurdities with style and theatrical force. In the process, it preserved her and displaced her at once. To remember dramatic MOLL is not necessarily to remember Mary Frith. It is to remember what London wanted from her image once it became profitable to aestheticize it. Still, one should not assume this transformation stripped her of all agency. Mary Frith was not a passive object around whom stories simply happened. Everything in her surviving image suggests a woman acutely aware of spectatorship. She knew she was seen. She knew too that being seen could be turned to advantage. This is what makes the reports of her own proximity to theatrical culture so tantalizing. If she appeared before audiences, played music, or inserted herself into public performance, then the boundary between woman and legend was not merely imposed from outside. She may have stepped into it willingly or at least pragmatically. She may have understood that if London insisted on making her into a spectacle, she could choose not to vanish from the spectacle but to occupy it. There is a kind of genius in that, though it is not innocent genius. To participate in one's own myth-making is risky. The myth will always exceed its maker. Yet for someone like Mary, already burdened with notoriety, participation may have offered the only alternative to silence. If she could not stop moralists, playwrights, or gossipers from speaking her name, she might at least ensure that the name arrived with some force of her own attached to it. One senses in her story again and again this refusal to retreat into private shame. Where another woman might have sought disappearance, Mary remained visible. She became harder to pity because she would not adopt the posture pity demanded. This is one reason the theatrical MOLL proved so durable. She gave audiences a female figure who did not ask to be redeemed into softness. She was witty without being docile, visible without apology, defiant without collapsing immediately into tragic ruin. That did not make her free. It made her legible in a new way. The stage allowed a culture nervous about unruly women to enjoy one under controlled conditions. A play can contain what life cannot. It can let the audience flirt with social instability and then leave the playhouse feeling order has somehow survived the encounter. But even contained instability leaves traces. Viewers carried MOLL back into the city in their imagination. They could not unsee the possibility she represented. That possibility was as much about class as gender. Mary Frith did not become legendary as an aristocratic rebel or an ornamental eccentric. She emerged from the city's lower and middling urban life, from spaces where survival, crime, commerce, and reputation pressed closely together. The theater translated this rougher material into something broader, but it did not erase the class tension at its center. A woman like MOLL unsettled not only because she crossed gender boundaries, but because she did so without the protective polish of elite status. Her boldness was streetwise, not courtly. Her authority came not from lineage but from nerve. She carried the city on her. That made her harder to dismiss as mere fashion and more alarming as social fact. The audience would have recognized this immediately. They knew the type or thought they did. They knew noisy women, swaggering apprentices, cheats, buyers of second-hand goods, tavern talkers, women who lived too publicly, women who smoked, women who swore, women who survived by means not easily admitted in polite speech. MOLL condensed these urban realities into a single body vivid enough to hold contradiction. She could be admired and condemned in the same breath. That is often the sign of a figure who has touched something culturally useful. She allowed people to rehearse their own judgments while enjoying the energy of what they judged. And so Mary Frith entered a new form of life, afterlife before death. Most people acquire afterlives only once they are gone and can no longer resist interpretation. Mary acquired one while still moving through London's streets. That fact alone is extraordinary. It meant she had to live not only with accusation and punishment, but with representation. Somewhere in the city there existed a version of herself she did not fully control, speaking lines she had not written, carrying meanings others had chosen. One wonders what it felt like if indeed she witnessed it closely. Pride, resentment, amusement, recognition, envy, calculation? Perhaps all at once. To see oneself transformed into a public character is to undergo a kind of symbolic dismemberment. Parts are taken. Parts are polished. Parts are erased. The living person remains but no longer alone. Once legend begins, solitude ends. From here forward, Mary Frith could never again belong only to record or memory. She belonged to culture. That did not protect her from law, poverty, or bodily decline. But it altered the scale on which she existed. The city could now speak of her through dramatic shorthand. MOLL CUTPURSE no longer referred only to an individual woman. It referred to a type, a challenge, an emblem of roaring female unruliness. Her name became a kind of social verb, a means of invoking defiance, scandal, and ambiguous freedom. And yet the irony should not be missed. The same culture that sought to discipline Mary had now canonized her in performance. The same city that rebuked her public boldness had bought tickets to enjoy its stylized form. The same anxieties about women, disorder, and visibility that fueled her punishment now fueled her immortality. This is not hypocrisy in the simple sense, though there is plenty of that. It is something more structural. Urban culture needed figures like Mary precisely because it feared what they revealed. The unruly woman serves as a boundary marker, but also as a fantasy of escape from the suffocating demands of order. She is condemned so that she may be contemplated safely. She is admired so long as admiration can be disavowed. The stage gave London permission to do both. It is important, though, not to let the brilliance of theatrical Mall eclipse the harsher truth of Mary Frith's actual circumstances. A dramatized figure may be witty, coherent, and vividly autonomous. A living woman in early modern London remained vulnerable to arrest, ridicule, confinement, economic insecurity, and violence. The gap between dramatic power and lived precarity was wide. That gap is one of the great cruelties of celebrity, especially female celebrity. The image grows stronger even as the body remains exposed. The public consumes boldness while the person who generated it continues to pay the price. Mary paid it repeatedly. But what the theater could not take from her was the fact that without her, there would have been no Mall to dramatize. Whatever liberties playwrights took, whatever moral framing they imposed, whatever simplifications later memory would prefer, the original shock belonged to Mary herself. She had lived loudly enough, visibly enough, and provocatively enough to become theatrically useful. She had forced London to think about her. That is no small achievement in a city full of disposable lives. What the stage did was preserve the energy of that achievement and detach it from the instability of one mortal woman. From this point on, Mary Frith would exist in two intertwined chronologies. In one, she continued to age, offend, survive, and move through the city as a real and vulnerable person. In the other, Mall had already begun the long journey toward historical myth. The first chronology would end with death. The second would not. It would travel through pamphlets, anecdotes, later biographies, moral retellings, romantic reconstructions, feminist recovery, theatrical revival, and popular history. It would gather admiration in centuries that had once offered disgust. It would gather simplification wherever contradiction proved difficult to hold. That second life began here. On the stage and in the street, Mary Frith became larger than herself. Not more truthful necessarily. Not easier to know. But larger. A woman who had already unsettled London's categories was now released into the city's machinery of repetition with fresh force. The theater did not solve the riddle of MOLL CUTPURSE. It multiplied it. Was she criminal or critic of hypocrisy? Grotesque or icon? Warning or fantasy? Public nuisance or rare female self-creation? The stage ensured such questions would outlive the woman. And perhaps that is the truest mark of legend. Not that it clarifies a life, but that it keeps a life in motion long after certainty has failed. Mary Frith entered the playhouse as scandalous material. She emerged as cultural memory. The church had tried to humble her. The courts had tried to classify her. Correction houses had tried to discipline her. The theater did something both kinder and more dangerous. It made her unforgettable. Chapter 7. Fame, Vice, and Survival. The real Mary Frith after the legend began. Legend has a cruel habit of arriving before the body is finished with life. Once the stage had done its work, once gossip and print and performance had hardened Mary Frith into something recognizable beyond the reach of ordinary scandal, she faced a strange and punishing condition. She had to go on living as herself after MOLL CUTPURSE had already become public property. For many, notoriety ends a life socially. For Mary, it appears to have remade life instead, forcing her to inhabit the uneasy space between person and emblem, between flesh and caricature, between the necessities of survival and the demands of an audience that now expected her to remain legible as herself at all times. That expectation was its own prison. A woman might sometimes escape her past in a city as large as London, provided she could sink low enough into anonymity, alter her companions, or accept a diminished life in quieter corners. Mary Frith could no longer do so easily. Her visibility, once a tool, had become permanent. Her name carried with it a pre-written script of boldness, criminality, gender disorder, and spectacle. Wherever she appeared, she risked being read through it. The public woman is denied the ordinary privilege of inconsistency. She cannot be tired without seeming fallen from type, cannot be cautious without seeming broken, cannot be ordinary without disappointing the appetite that helped make her notorious. So Mary had to survive not only poverty, accusation, and institutional punishment, but expectation. This chapter belongs to that harsher, less theatrically satisfying part of her story, the years in which fame itself became labor. The city had made her memorable. But memory does not feed a person. Legend does not pay rent unless it can be converted into influence, clients, protection, or cash. If Mary continued to move through London with notoriety intact, then she must also have continued to improvise ways of turning notoriety into something materially useful. She could not live on symbolism. She had to live on arrangements. That is where the real afterlife of scandal begins, not in reverence but in management. The historical Mary, after the flowering of her legend, seems increasingly bound up with brokerage, mediation, and the murky economies by which stolen goods circulated, disappeared, and sometimes found their way back to owners through unofficial channels. This world suited someone of her temperament and experience. A broker lives by information, nerve, and recognizability. A broker benefits from being known in the right circles. A broker does not need innocence, she needs access. And access, in London, often depended less on moral standing than on usefulness. Mary had become useful in ways respectability could not admit plainly. A city obsessed with property generated not only thieves but intermediaries. Once an object was stolen, those who wished to recover it often found that law was clumsy, public, slow, or humiliating. Quiet solutions could be preferable. The same society that denounced criminal networks frequently made practical use of them, especially when urgency, embarrassment, or convenience outweighed principle. A woman like Mary, already notorious, already believed to know the city's illicit channels, could thrive in that contradiction. She did not need to be loved. She needed to be thought capable. Capability was her truest currency. By this stage in her life, Mary Frith seems to have become something larger than a mere petty thief and also something more complicated than a theatrical rebel. She occupied that peculiarly urban role played by those who understand how systems fail and where the failures can be monetized. She knew, or was believed to know, where goods moved once detached from their lawful owners. She knew who traded with whom, who could be pressured, who could be paid, who would prefer recovery to prosecution, and which kinds of scandal respectable people most wanted concealed. Such knowledge makes a person dangerous. It also makes them necessary. Necessity is one of the great protections afforded to the disreputable. Not complete protection, of course. Mary remained vulnerable to the law, to moral condemnation, and to the unstable goodwill of those around her. But usefulness complicates disgust. A society may condemn a woman publicly and still consult her privately. Men who would never defend her in principle might still deal with her in practice. This is one of the bitterest truths beneath the legend of MOLL CUTPURSE. The very people who despised the social meaning of a woman like Mary may well have relied on the services of women like her whenever ordinary channels proved inconvenient. She lived in those hypocrisies like a second skin. That does not mean these years were triumphant. The temptation in writing about notorious women is always to mistake continued visibility for continued power. But survival is not sovereignty. Mary's life after legend began was likely a hard negotiation with age, scrutiny, and the diminishing elasticity of the body. Boldness that looks magnetic in youth can become more dangerous with time. The city remains hungry for spectacle, but it is less kind to aging women who have built their identities around public force. A swaggering man may age into rough authority. A swaggering woman risks being rewritten as grotesque, pitiable, or obscene. The cultural room permitted to unruly women narrows as they grow older. Mary must have known this. One imagines a woman increasingly conscious that she was carrying not only her own aging body but the weight of an image she did not fully own. To remain MOLL required stamina, physical, social, emotional. It required holding one's nerve under a gaze that had long since ceased to be accidental. Every appearance risked comparison with reputation. Every rumor attached itself more quickly because her name was already available as shorthand. Every shift in fortune could be interpreted as narrative. MOLL rises, MOLL falls, MOLL sins, MOLL boasts, MOLL declines. Public identity makes ordinary struggle legible as theater. And the theater of decline is especially cruel to women. It is possible that Mary at times leaned into the notoriety still, treating it not only as burden but as the last reliable form of leverage available to her. Some people become addicted to the only identity that has ever given them purchase in the world, even when that identity wounds them. For Mary, boldness had long served as armor. Scandal had become a tool. Public recognition had offered danger, yes, but also a kind of indispensability. To surrender that entirely would have meant surrendering the means by which she had forced the city to make room for her. Better, perhaps, to continue as a known force than to dwindle into the anonymity reserved for the worn-out and disposable. Yet continuation has costs. A reputation built on transgression does not settle into peace. It must either escalate, harden, or begin to decay. Mary's later life seems to have moved toward hardening, less the sparkling provocation of the theatrical roaring girl, more the rough-edged persistence of a woman who knew too much, had seen too much, and had no reason to flatter a society that had never offered her safety. The glamour that later centuries sometimes project onto her obscures this. There is nothing inherently glamorous about having to survive by wit among thieves, buyers, officers, customers, mockers, and moralists while carrying the knowledge that one's body has already been claimed as a cautionary example. Still she endured. Endurance may be the most radical thing about her. Not the clothing alone, not even the scandal, but the fact of duration. Mary Frith did not flash once across the public record and vanish. She persisted. She remained. She weathered arrest, rebuke, theatrical appropriation, and the social violence of being made into a symbol, and still she appears in the historical imagination as singularly alive. That continuity matters. It means her notoriety was not a single episode but a mode of being. She lived her life under conditions that would have broken many others into obscurity. Why did she endure? Partly temperament, certainly. But temperament is never enough. One endures because one keeps finding uses. For oneself, for others, for one's image, one's knowledge, one's associations. Mary had trained herself in usefulness. She knew how to inhabit contradiction. She could be publicly scandalous and privately serviceable. She could be mocked as disorderly and still remain a point of access to goods, gossip, and urban intelligence. She may even have understood that the more others insisted on her deviance, the more fixed and memorable her role became. To be fixed in that way is dangerous, but it is also marketable. The line between infamy and enterprise was thin. Mary's fame could attract those curious to see her, those needing her help, those seeking association with her notoriety, and those eager to test or challenge her. Fame is never a neutral asset. It pulls predators as well as patrons. It invites envy, exploitation, and opportunism. Women famous for impropriety are especially vulnerable to being used by others who enjoy their celebrity while refusing them dignity. One suspects Mary learned long ago to read such motives quickly. She had to know the difference between someone amused by MOLL and someone prepared to treat Mary as a person with dangerous knowledge. Perhaps that difference mattered less and less. The longer a person lives inside a public mask, the more the distinction between self and performance begins to fray. There must have been moments, in a room after business, in the aftermath of a bargain, in sickness, in weariness, in solitude, when Mary felt the distance between the living woman and the roaring creature others expected her to be. But the archive almost never preserves such quiet interiors. It preserves what the public could see or use. Arrests, anecdotes, business, reports, performances, scandal. The emotional cost of maintaining notoriety remains largely hidden, as it does for so many figures who become legend before they become old. That hidden cost should not be sentimentalized, but neither should it be ignored. Mary's later years force us to confront a more difficult version of her than the stage prefers. Not the exhilarating boundary breaker alone, but the working survivor. Not the witty emblem only, but the aging woman in a brutal city, still making herself necessary. Not the simple icon of resistance, but the person who had to go on bartering with a world that consumed her image while withholding ease. The romance of MOLL dissolves somewhat here, and that dissolution is instructive. The real afterlife of public defiance is often drudgery. Managing contacts, sustaining fear or usefulness, carrying one's story like a trade sign no one will allow to be taken down. Yet there is grandeur in that drudgery too, if a hard grandeur. Mary Frith made a life out of materials many would have found unlivable. Shame, scrutiny, contradiction, criminal association, and the city's endless appetite for spectacle. She did not redeem those materials into virtue. She did not transcend them cleanly. She worked them. She wore them. She converted them where she could into leverage and bread. In this sense, her later life tells us more than the theatrical version ever could. It shows the labor beneath legend. It shows what it means to survive not as symbol in retrospect but as body in time. The city around her, meanwhile, kept changing in ways both subtle and profound. London's appetite for novelty did not diminish, but novelty always hunts fresh subjects. No scandal remains permanently new. Mary, to remain vivid, had to carry not only her established infamy but the constant threat of becoming old news. That may be another reason her association with brokerage and urban knowledge matters so much. When spectacle fades, utility must remain. The face once famous for clothing and scandal can still command value if it becomes attached to information and exchange. Mary seems to have made that shift, whether deliberately or by necessity. In this, she resembles many famous women after the first blaze of public attention, forced to transform charisma into infrastructure. The world rarely allows them to remain luminous without function. They must become go-betweens, managers, brokers of reputation, keepers of secrets, custodians of networks. Mary's version of this was grimmer and more illicit than most, but the pattern is recognizable. Once the thrill of scandal settles into memory, what remains is the question of livelihood. Mary answered it in the only city-shaped way available to someone with her skills and constraints, by occupying the channels through which people, goods, and stories moved. Stories perhaps most of all. For by now Mary Frith was not merely living her life. She was living among stories about her, against stories about her, sometimes through them. Her survival depended partly on the fact that others already believed certain things of her. Belief can destroy, but it can also simplify negotiation. If the city thinks you dangerous, you need not prove danger constantly. If it thinks you connected, people will bring business. If it thinks you shameless, your enemies may waste energy trying to humiliate what humiliation no longer governs. Mary seems to have inhabited this logic with remarkable steadiness. And yet no steadiness lasts forever. Age, illness, and mortality eventually reduce even the most defiant reputations to a different scale. The body insists on its own ending. The city that once seemed impossible to exhaust goes on without waiting. A woman who made herself unforgettable must still someday become vulnerable to the common humiliations of decline. That is part of what gives Mary's later life its melancholy force. For all her boldness, she could not permanently outwit time. The public image remained sharp. The mortal body inevitably did not. Here, in the long middle years after legend had already begun, what matters most is the strange and difficult achievement of continued existence. Mary Frith lived on as both person and symbol. She endured the violence of being public. She converted notoriety into function. She survived through knowledge, brokerage, nerve, and the city's own dependence on what it claimed to despise. If the roaring girl on stage offered London a thrilling fiction of female defiance, the real Mary after fame began offered something darker and more impressive. The daily fact of a woman who refused to disappear even after the culture had taken possession of her name. That refusal was not glamorous. It was work. And Mary Frith worked at survival with the same force that had once made her scandalous. Chapter 8. Decline, Death, and the Afterlife of MOLL CUTPURSE. Every legend ends in the body. It does not matter how loudly a woman has lived, how scandalously she has dressed, how many crowds have turned to stare, how many magistrates have rebuked her, or how many playwrights have found profit in her name. In the end there is still illness, still age, still the slow humiliations by which flesh reminds even the notorious that it belongs to time. The city may make a person into symbol, but the body insists on remaining mortal. And so it was with Mary Frith. By the time the later years closed around her, the roaring girl had become something more complicated and sadder than the electric figure who first strode into public view. She had outlived the shock of novelty. She had outlasted her own first scandal. She had survived the court, the church, the stage, the gossip, the moralists, and the long labor of existing beneath a public name that was both weapon and livelihood. That survival was extraordinary. But survival is not triumph in any simple sense. It is attrition. It is accumulation. It is endurance worn into the body until endurance itself begins to resemble damage. The city, of course, did not stop for her. London rarely pauses to honor the aging. It especially does not pause for aging women who made their names by public disorder. The same streets that once magnified a person's presence eventually absorb it without ceremony. New scandals arise. New faces attract appetite. New bodies become available for judgment and entertainment. A woman like Mary Frith might remain famous, even notorious, while simultaneously becoming old news in the daily life of the city. This is one of the quieter brutalities of public life. One may remain an emblem long after ceasing to be a priority. And yet Mary still remained Mary, still subject to the stubborn facts of living. There is something especially harsh in imagining her final years because the record, as so often, does not give us softness. It gives the outline of decline rather than the interior experience of it. We do not sit beside her in confidence. We do not hear her name her fears. We do not know what parts of herself she regretted, defended, cherished, or misunderstood by the end. What we have instead is the knowledge that her life, so long lived under scrutiny, could not finally escape the common terms of bodily deterioration. Illness reduced what notoriety had enlarged. Age altered the public surface on which scandal had once fed. The living woman was drawn, at last, toward the same vulnerable human conclusion that awaits those who never make a scene at all. That is part of what gives her story its strange dignity. For years Mary had been used by others as a symbol of excess. Too visible, too masculine, too bold, too criminal, too shameless, too public. But age strips symbols unevenly. It removes some of the brightness that made them useful to the crowd and reveals the ordinary mortal underneath. A notorious old woman is harder for society to read. She cannot be contained easily within the thrilling shape of scandal, yet neither is she granted the tenderness often reserved for those remembered as respectable. She becomes instead something awkward to culture, a remnant of former disorder still carrying the weight of meanings attached long ago. One suspects Mary bore that awkwardness to the end. Perhaps by then she had stopped caring what the city wanted from her. Or perhaps she cared very much and found that care growing sharper as the body failed to keep pace with the legend. That is one of the cruelest splits fame can produce. The public image remains vigorous in memory while the person who generated it grows tired, ill, slower, more dependent, less able to inhabit the stance that once protected them. Mary Frith had lived for so long in tension with social expectation that one wonders whether decline felt like a final indignity or simply one more enemy to outstare. Either way, she could not defeat it. The body always wins in the end, though the victory is not noble. It comes through weakness, pain, exhaustion, breath shortening, appetite diminishing, sleep turning strange, the ordinary architecture of self-loosening without permission. For a woman whose life had been so bound to public presence, bodily decline must have carried a particular violence. To lose control over one's own body after spending decades fighting to control how that body was read by others is a bitter final reversal. The woman who had once unsettled London by occupying space in the wrong clothes and the wrong posture would finally be reduced, like everyone else, to fragility. And still, even here, the legend did not entirely release her. Mary Frith's death did not erase MOLL CUTPURSE. On the contrary, death often makes public possession easier. Once the person is gone, the culture grows bolder. Contradictions can be smoothed. Rougher edges can be sharpened for effect. The dead cannot object when anecdote hardens into fact, when moral lesson replaces complexity, when admiration rewrites vice, or when vice is exaggerated to keep admiration safely at bay. Death frees the storytellers. It gives them the one condition every legend requires in order to expand without resistance: silence from its subject. That silence was fertile ground. After Mary's death, the work of transformation accelerated. What had already been rumor, scandal, performance, and partial biography now became material for afterlife. The woman who had once walked London's streets under the burden of her own name passed into the hands of pamphleteers, compilers, moralizers, antiquarians, playwrights, historians, and later readers who would each take from her what their age desired. Some preferred the criminal. Some preferred the eccentric. Some preferred the cross-dressed rebel. Some preferred the monstrous warning. Some, in later centuries, would reach for proto-feminist language, eager to reclaim her as a woman ahead of her time. Others would cling to the thrill of underworld vice and dress her once again in moral shadow. All of them in different ways consumed her. This is the final violence done to notorious women. They are not allowed to become merely dead. Their bodies end, but their usefulness continues. The culture keeps returning to them because they remain serviceable sites for argument. Mary Frith could be used to discuss criminality, femininity, transgression, sexuality, public spectacle, cross-dressing, urban disorder, theater, class mobility, female boldness, and the porous line between self-invention and social panic. She became durable because she had always contained more than one story, and death only widened the available room for interpretation. Yet it would be too simple to call this process theft alone. There is something almost fitting in the fact that Mary's afterlife proved so unruly. A woman who had resisted containment in life was never likely to settle into one stable meaning in death. She remained difficult. Even the accounts that try to pin her down reveal their own uncertainty. Was she a common thief inflated by gossip? A criminal broker with unusual skill? A theatrical self-advertiser? A moral panic in petticoats and breeches? A woman punished less for what she did than for how she did being public? A proto-celebrity? A grotesque? A survivor? The answer refuses to sit still, which is perhaps the surest sign that the real Mary Frith has not been wholly annihilated by myth. Something in her still resists. That resistance is not clean historical access. We do not suddenly recover the full private woman beneath the layers of representation. She remains partially hidden and likely always will. But the instability itself tells us something true. Flat legends usually belong to flat lives, or at least to lives easily bent into singular meaning. Mary's life cannot be bent so easily. Every attempt leaves something protruding: criminality that resists romantic rescue, boldness that resists moral condemnation, theatricality that resists documentary certainty, usefulness that resists purity, suffering that resists glamour. She remains difficult because she was difficult. Death only enlarged the difficulty. Over time, the city that once knew her directly gave way to other kinds of memory. London changed. Regimes changed. Tastes changed. The streets that had formed her acquired new names, new buildings, new economies, new crowds who did not know the texture of the old ones. Yet Mary Frith endured in cultural residue. Her survival across centuries says as much about the societies that remembered her as it does about the woman herself. Each age found its own Moll. That is one reason she feels at once near and remote. She has been translated too often. We meet not one Mary Frith, but many partial recreations standing atop the unstable foundation of the historical person. The Victorians, for example, could recoil from her vulgarity while also feeling the delicious pull of her notoriety. Later writers, especially those drawn to rogues and underworld curiosities, could make her colorful, theatrical, almost lovable in her audacity, provided her rougher edges remained framed as anomaly. Modern readers often encounter her with different appetites altogether: curiosity about gender nonconformity, interest in celebrity culture before modern media, fascination with women who refused prescribed femininity, impatience with the moral brutality of earlier centuries. None of these readings is wholly wrong. None is sufficient. That insufficiency is where history lives. To write about Mary Frith honestly is to accept that the ending does not clarify the beginning. Death does not grant sudden moral order. It does not tell us whether to condemn or admire. It does not allow us to flatten a hard life into a message about courage or corruption. What it does instead is reveal the final terms of the bargain between body and legend. The body ceases. The legend continues. The legend changes. The culture keeps taking from the dead what it needs. And somewhere inside that continuing theft there remains the trace of an actual woman who once had to wake, walk, bargain, defy, be punished, age, and finally die. It is worth pausing there because too often the dead are made weightless by historical writing. Mary Frith was not born as an emblem. She was not put on earth to become useful to scholars, playwrights, moralists, or future readers in search of a book subject. She was a person who lived in a hard city with a hard temperament and made from that combination a life so public that posterity has never stopped peering at it. The most respectful thing one can do, perhaps, is not to purify her but to let the roughness remain. To let the criminality remain. To let the vanity, performance, danger, wit and damage remain. To let death close over her not as redemption but as completion. And still, of course, she rises again in narrative. That is why she remains with us. Not because she was exemplary in any simple moral sense, but because she exposed things her culture preferred to disguise. She exposed how much gender depended on costume and punishment. She exposed how much urban order relied on spectacle. She exposed the hypocrisy of a society that condemned public women while feeding on them. She exposed the intimacy between crime and commerce. She exposed how notoriety could become livelihood and how punishment could become advertisement. She exposed, too, the appetite of history itself for difficult women. After death, her body was gone. But the questions attached to her remained infuriatingly alive. Who gets to be visible? Under what terms? What does a woman owe to respectability in exchange for toleration? What happens when she refuses the bargain? Can defiance ever be clean in a world structured by compromise? At what point does self-invention become self-entrapment? How much of scandal is merely society catching sight of its own anxieties in someone else's body? Mary Frith continues to matter because these questions have not gone away. They have only changed their clothing. The roaring girl still walks, though not in flesh. She walks through plays, biographies, academic debates, popular histories, feminist recoveries, queer readings, costume studies, crime writing, and every retelling that tries once more to decide what she was. She walks through modern fascination with women who refuse containment. She walks through every attempt to make her either easier to admire or easier to condemn. She walks, too, through the silences, the places where the archive failed her, where the city refused to care enough to preserve what tenderness or exhaustion or private grief she may have possessed. Her afterlife is loud. Her inward life remains largely hidden. That imbalance is itself part of the tragedy, but not the whole of it. There is also a kind of victory here, though not a comfortable one. Mary Frith did not disappear in the manner so many women of her class and period did. The institutions that sought to shame her preserved her. The culture that wanted to use her could not stop returning to her. The legend that might have swallowed a lesser figure never fully stabilized. She remains a trouble to categories even now. That trouble is her final inheritance. Not innocence. Not sainthood. Not simple rebellion. Trouble. And perhaps that is the truest ending available to a woman like MOLL CUTPURSE. Not a moral lesson neatly tied. Not a fall that satisfies authority. Not a redemption that comforts later readers. But a death that closes one life while opening 100 arguments. A body reduced to mortality, and a name released into history where it will go on refusing to sit quietly. Mary Frith died. MOLL CUTPURSE did not. Chapter 9. What MOLL meant. Women, disorder, and the fear of freedom. A life becomes historically important not only because of what it contains, but because of what others cannot stop seeing in it. This is why Mary Frith endured. Not because she was the greatest criminal of her age. Not because she led armies, changed laws, founded movements, or left behind some polished body of writing in which she explained herself to posterity. She endured because she entered the cultural imagination at a fault line. She stood where anxieties met. Gender, crime, clothing, public space, class tension, theater, punishment, and the dangerous possibility that a woman might become visible on terms not granted to her by respectability. Mary Frith mattered because she meant too much. She became the kind of figure who could not be left alone. That is always a sign of deeper disturbance. Societies do not obsess equally over every offender. They select certain bodies for repeated scrutiny because those bodies appear to threaten more than law. An ordinary thief may be punished and forgotten. A disorderly woman may be mocked and dismissed. But a woman who combines criminal suspicion with public self-possession, masculine attire, social insolence, and theatrical memorability becomes symbolically overcharged. She begins to carry arguments larger than herself. Mary Frith became such a figure because she unsettled not just behavior, but interpretation itself. What was she? That question haunted her own age and has never entirely stopped. Was she a thief first and last, with later ages guilty of romantic embellishment? Was she a public nuisance made larger by a culture addicted to scandal? Was she evidence of female moral collapse? Was she simply cleverer than the people who wished to shame her? Was she a grotesque, a warning, a fraud, a broker, a wit, a spectacle, an opportunist, a prototype of feminine independence, or an uncomfortable combination of all of these? The instability of the answer is the point. Mary Frith could not be absorbed easily into the categories available to her contemporaries, and that failure of absorption reveals much about the world that produced her. The early modern city liked women legible. A woman might be virtuous or fallen, obedient or disorderly, married or suspect, silent or scolding, modest or shameless. These were not equal categories, but they were familiar ones. They allowed the culture to read women quickly and act accordingly. Mary disrupted that speed. She was too public to be merely private vice, too forceful to be merely pitiable, too associated with criminality to be comfortably celebrated, and too theatrically compelling to be easily dismissed. She made classification labor. Classification is one of the hidden labors of social order. A city as crowded and unstable as London relied upon fast judgments. One read clothes, bearing, speech, company, and movement to decide what kind of person one faced. The system was imperfect, often cruel, and constantly anxious about deception, which is precisely why visible signs mattered so much. Mary Frith attacked the reliability of those signs simply by inhabiting them wrongly. She wore gender as though it were available for handling rather than fixed by divine design. She occupied public space with a confidence coded masculine. She refused the choreography of female shame. She attached criminal rumor to a body already socially illegible. No wonder she became so useful as a warning. She seemed to prove that once women stepped beyond modesty, all distinctions might begin to collapse. But the culture's obsession with proving that point betrays another fear as well. What if the collapse revealed that some distinctions were always more fragile than they claimed to be? This is the deeper tension beneath the story of MOLL CUTPURSE. She did not simply break rules. She exposed the degree to which rules depended on performance, surveillance, and repetition. Gender in her world was constantly presented as natural, yet every institutional reaction to Mary reveals how hard that nature had to be policed. If femininity were truly effortless and self-evident, why would clothing matter so much? Why would a woman in male attire provoke such alarm? Why would authorities invest so heavily in public shame, correction, and moral description? The answer is uncomfortable but clear, because order that must be continually enforced is never as stable as it pretends. Mary made that instability visible. This is one reason later readers keep reaching for her whenever questions of gender become newly urgent. Each age thinks it has discovered something original in her, when in truth what it has discovered is the same old discomfort in a different language. The 17th century saw impudence, deviance, criminality, and disorder. Later centuries saw eccentricity, vulgarity, curiosity, proto-modern rebellion, theatrical sex ambiguity, underworld glamour. Our own era sees still other possibilities, shaped by its own vocabularies of gender expression, self-fashioning, performance, and resistance. None of these readings is entirely detached from the historical Mary, but none can claim to contain her completely. This should make us cautious. There is always a temptation to rescue difficult women from history by making them easier for the present to love. One can feel that temptation strongly with Mary Frith. She is bold. She is memorable. She affronted social convention. She refused feminine quietude. She became a kind of celebrity under hostile conditions. All this makes her attractive to modern readers weary of obedient heroines and suspicious of old moral verdicts. But rescue through admiration can distort almost as much as condemnation. Mary was not merely a misunderstood rebel floating cleanly above the grime of her age. She moved through real criminal economies. She may have profited from other people's losses. She lived by hard compromises. He was not pure. The refusal of purity is part of what makes her historically valuable. Too often women are admitted into historical interest only when they can be moralist in one direction or the other, either saints unfairly maligned, or sinners richly deserving disgrace. Mary resists both comforts. She forces us to confront a more difficult possibility, that a woman can be compromised, cunning, criminally entangled, publicly abrasive, and still reveal the violence of the culture that judged her. The existence of her faults does not cancel the truth of that culture's fear. Nor does the culture's cruelty erase the fact that she could be ruthless. She compels us to hold contradiction without immediately resolving it into innocence or villainy. That is rare and it is uncomfortable. Most societies prefer women symbolic, not contradictory. Symbols can be used. Contradictions must be thought through. A figure like Mary Frith pushes against the simplification by which gendered moral order is maintained. She reminds us that the categories of bad woman and dangerous woman are not identical, though they often overlap in the public imagination. She was dangerous partly because she was seen as bad, yes, but also because she suggested a form of self-direction not properly licensed by the structures meant to govern women. She made herself public without permission. That alone can appear threatening even when separated from crime. Public female selfhood has long been treated as a problem in need of explanation. Why is she out? Why is she dressed that way? Why is she speaking so loudly? Why does she not seem ashamed? Why does she take up room? Why does she attract attention? Why does she appear to enjoy attracting it? These questions echo through every age in slightly altered form. Mary Frith provoked them with unusual intensity because she lived in a culture especially committed to visible hierarchy and gendered containment. Yet one does not need to reach very far to feel their modern afterlife. The unruly woman continues to fascinate because she continues to expose the bargains respectability demands in exchange for toleration. Mary refused the bargain too openly to be forgiven. That refusal helps explain why the language around her so often swells beyond proportion. She was described in tones that exceed mere civic annoyance. Moral disgust, sexual suspicion, social alarm, theatrical relish, all accumulate around her. This overstatement is instructive. It tells us that what offended was not simply theft or costume, but the possibility that a woman might live visibly in defiance of ordinary feminine discipline and still remain compelling rather than immediately broken. The authorities wanted her not only punished but interpreted. They needed her to mean corruption because alternative meanings were too dangerous. Yet alternative meanings kept leaking through. The stage saw them. Audiences sensed them. Later readers continued to sense them. Even those who condemned her could not entirely strip her of force. She remained lively where a proper warning should have become flat. She remained witty, vivid, self-possessed, and socially disruptive. She retained the troubling energy of someone who had not consented to her role as cautionary tale. That energy is what later centuries have kept rediscovering under different names. Some call it agency. Some call it audacity. Some call it proto-feminism. Some, less romantically and perhaps more accurately, call it survival with theatrical intelligence. Survival may be the better word. Freedom is too clean for Mary Frith. She was not free in the sense later readers often mean. She was still bound by poverty, vulnerability, legal risk, public ridicule, aging, and the constant violence of being made into a spectacle. She did not stand outside her society in serene sovereignty. She fought within it, improvised within it, traded within it, and was damaged by it. If she knew forms of freedom, they were tactical freedoms. The freedom of movement stolen from surveillance, the freedom of speech wrested from shame, the freedom of visibility seized in defiance of expectation, the freedom to become difficult to govern even when never fully escaping governance. Those smaller freedoms frighten people because they were visible. A woman who suffers quietly can be absorbed into the moral order as a lesson in weakness or pity. A woman who suffers noisily, strategically, publicly, and who sometimes seems to draw power from the very conditions meant to humble her, is far harder to absorb. She forces the culture to confront its own complicity in producing the thing it fears. Mary was not born outside the system. She was produced by it as much as she resisted it. London's crowds, theatres, markets, punishments, and hypocrisies shaped her. The very institutions that sought to discipline her preserved her. The city made her legible as scandal and then could not stop looking. In that sense, Mary Frith reveals not individual deviation alone, but urban appetite. Cities create unusual people partly because they create unusual opportunities for anonymity, reinvention, collision, spectacle, and repetition. London was especially fertile ground for figures like Mary because it was a place where status and instability rubbed constantly together. The city generated both moral panic and theatrical delight. It punished deviance and profited from it. It needed visible examples and also needed the excitement those examples supplied. Mary became one of London's most successful contradictions because she embodied the city's own contradictions so exactly. She was theatrical and practical, criminal and useful, condemned and consumed. To ask what MOLL meant then is also to ask what London meant by needing her. The answer may be that she allowed the culture to imagine disorder in a body it could repeatedly stage, shame, and discuss. She made anxiety manageable by giving it a face and a name. But she also exceeded that function. Every time the culture tried to reduce her to warning, some remainder escaped. Style, wit, force, endurance, ambiguity. She was not content to serve as passive evidence of female downfall. She kept acting, kept appearing, kept surviving, kept generating interpretations authority did not entirely control. That remainder is what makes her feel alive across centuries. It is also what makes her dangerous to tidy history. Tidy history wants to know whether she should be admired or condemned. Tidy history wants a verdict. But Mary Frith belongs to a more difficult register. She should be read, not resolved. She should be placed back within the crowded, punitive, appetite-driven world that produced her and then allowed to remain contradictory there. To do less is to repeat the simplifying violence already done to her in her own age. She was made into monster, curiosity, warning, playhouse figure, underworld queen, and later icon. The historian's task is not to pick the most flattering mask and fix it on her forever. It is to keep the masks visible and ask why each one was needed. That question leads beyond Mary herself. Why are cultures so invested in women who break legibility? Why do they alternately punish, eroticize, commodify, and mythologize them? Why does visible female defiance continue to produce a mixture of fear and fascination? Why do women who refuse softness so often become public property? These are not only questions about the 17th century. They are perennial because the structures that generated them have never vanished entirely. They have only altered form. Mary Frith remains potent because she stands near the beginning of a recognizable cultural pattern. The woman made famous by refusing to behave, then repeatedly taken from herself by those determined to explain what her refusal means. That process is still with us. And perhaps this is where the chapter must come to rest. Not with a solved identity, but with a sharpened understanding of why she persists. Mary Frith mattered because she became the site at which a society's fear of female publicness, female theatricality, female criminality, and female self-direction could all be staged at once. She mattered because she was both product and critic of the city that made her. She mattered because she showed how much order relied on punishment, costume, and collective storytelling. She mattered because even in being used as a warning, she kept generating meanings authority could not fully control. She meant disorder, certainly. But beneath that, and more dangerously, she meant the possibility that a woman might make herself visible in the world without first becoming harmless. That possibility has always been difficult to forgive. Conclusion. The woman who would not sit still. Some women are remembered because they fit the story history prefers to tell. Mary Frith is remembered because she did not. She did not fit the obedient woman, the fallen woman, the repentant woman, or even the neatly triumphant rebel. She would not settle into the moral shapes her own age tried to force upon her, and she has not settled into the flattering shapes later ages have offered either. She remains difficult, unclear, compelling, too compromised for sainthood, too vivid for dismissal, too singular to vanish into the anonymous mass of the early modern poor. She moved through London like an irritation lodged beneath the skin of the city itself, and long after the body that housed her was gone, the irritation remained. That, in the end, is her real historical power. Not that she was perfect, nor that she was pure, nor even that she was always admirable, but that she exposed the world around her by refusing to sit quietly inside it. She exposed how much social order depended on spectacle. She exposed how much gender depended on costume, repetition, and punishment. She exposed how badly the city wanted women both visible and governable, entertaining and humble, public enough to be useful but never public enough to become uncontrollable. She exposed the hunger with which societies consume unruly women, turning them into warnings, fantasies, jokes, monsters, icons, or all of these in succession. She exposed, too, the instability of the categories through which those societies pretend to know themselves. Mary Frith was not simply a woman in men's clothes. She was a woman who made clothing matter too much for comfort. A woman who forced people to notice how heavily they relied on appearance to police truth. A woman who stepped into public space with the wrong confidence and made that confidence difficult to forget. A woman whose notoriety became inseparable from performance, and whose performance became inseparable from survival. She was a criminal in some measure, almost certainly. A broker. Scandal. A body under judgment. A maker of herself by rough means in a rough city. But she was also something more disturbing than any single charge could name. She was legible as disorder while remaining irreducible to it. That is why history keeps returning to her. It returns not because the facts are simple but because they are not. The archive offers glimpses, accusations, theatrical distortions, moralized descriptions, and fragments of a life whose meanings were contested almost from the beginning. Every generation that approaches Mary Frith finds itself tempted to resolve her, to make her easier to hold. Some have wanted to make her monstrous, as though exaggeration could restore the moral comfort she disrupted. Some have wanted to make her heroic, as though admiration could wash away the grime of criminal entanglement and the harsh compromises of urban survival. Both impulses tell us more about the needs of the interpreter than about the woman herself. Mary does not reward simplification. She asks for something harder, that we let contradiction remain visible. That contradiction is the true substance of her story. She was punished by institutions that helped preserve her. She was condemned by a city that could not stop watching her. She was transformed into theater while still alive to bear the consequences of being made into a character. She appears as both subject and symbol, both person and public construction, both user of spectacle and its victim. She lived by visibility and was harmed by it. She made herself memorable and paid dearly for memorability. She survived through wit, audacity, usefulness, and perhaps ruthlessness, yet never fully escaped the structures that marked her as dangerous. She was neither free nor fully contained. Very few historical women are allowed to remain in that register. Women are so often sorted after death into edifying boxes. The virtuous wife. The tragic victim. The wicked seductress. The exceptional genius. The saint. The martyr. The scandal. Mary Frith slips through these categories even now. She embarrasses moral certainty. She unsettles clean narrative. She refuses to offer historians the luxury of knowing exactly what to do with her. That refusal is itself part of her legacy. The woman who once unsettled London's surfaces continues to unsettle our interpretive habits. And perhaps that is why she feels, even now, uncannily modern. Not because she was ahead of her time in some simple celebratory sense, but because the structures that made her legible have not disappeared. We still live in cultures that police women's visibility. We still treat public female defiance as both spectacle and offense. We still punish women who take up too much space, dress against expectations, speak too boldly, refuse shame, or blur the categories through which others prefer to read them. We still turn such women into public property. We still debate whether they are to be admired, feared, corrected, or consumed. The details change. The machinery remains recognizable. Mary Frith belongs to that longer history of women made into arguments. But she also resists becoming merely an example. This is important. She was not born to illustrate a thesis about gender or crime or celebrity. She was not a symbol first and a person second. She was a human being who lived in a brutal, crowded, theatrical city and fashioned from its contradictions a life both precarious and unforgettable. She would have known hunger, negotiation, humiliation, danger, and calculation in ways no later romantic retelling can soften. If she sometimes seems dazzling, that dazzle should not blind us to the hardness of the world from which it emerged. If she sometimes seems admirable, that admiration should not tempt us into sanitizing her. If she sometimes seems morally compromised, that fact should not prevent us from seeing how heavily the culture around her relied on gendered punishment and spectacle. To understand Mary Frith is not to choose one of these truths over the others. It is to keep them in view together. That is what makes her more than anecdote. She is not merely a colorful rogue in breeches, not merely a tavern curiosity or theatrical footnote. She is a doorway into the social logic of early modern London. Its crowds, its anxieties, its hunger for sensation, its obsession with legibility, its blurred boundary between commerce and crime, and its ferocious discomfort with women who refuse to embody modest dependence. Through Mary we can see how punishment worked as performance, how notoriety became capital, how the stage borrowed from the street and the street from the stage, how public women were made and remade by the gaze of others. Through her we can also see how survival itself might become a form of cultural offense when enacted too visibly by the wrong person. This may be the deepest reason she endured. She survived in ways that were difficult to forgive. A woman may suffer and be tolerated. A woman may repent and be restored. A woman may even scandalize briefly and then be safely broken into silence. But a woman who remains, who stays visible, memorable, useful, and unashamed long enough to become part of the city's own symbolic life, becomes something harder to contain. Mary Frith became that something. She turned notoriety into a mode of existence. She learned to inhabit scandal so thoroughly that punishment could not fully separate her from it. She lived on the edge between self-invention and public appropriation and never ceased to trouble the line. And when she died, the trouble did not die with her. That is the final irony of the story. The institutions that sought to humble her helped guarantee she would be remembered. The theater that transformed her also kept her alive. The moralists who denounced her preserved the details that later readers would use to reconstruct her. The city that wanted to make a lesson of her gave her permanence instead. Mary Frith was supposed to be reduced by scandal. Instead, she was enlarged by it. Not in safety, not in peace, and certainly not in a form she fully controlled, but enlarged all the same. So what remains? Not certainty. Not innocence. Not one final verdict. What remains is a woman standing in the unstable light between record and myth, wearing too many meanings to be held by any single one. A woman who reminds us that history is often harshest on those who made themselves visible without permission. A woman whose life demonstrates that performance can be survival, that punishment can become publicity, that shame can fail, and that once a culture attaches itself to a difficult female figure, it may never quite finish with her. A woman who lived loudly enough that silence could not swallow her, though neither could memory ever leave her untouched. Mary Frith died. That much is simple. But the figure London called MOLL CUTPURSE still resists burial. She resists in the archive, where facts and fictions cling too closely to be cleanly separated. She resists in literature, where drama made her larger than law could manage. She resists in history, where scholars and readers keep returning to her because she illuminates too much to be ignored. She resists, too, in every later woman who has been stared at, renamed, moralized, and mythologized for daring to appear in public as something other than harmless. If there is a lesson in her life, it is not a comfortable one. It is that societies fear women who can survive being looked at. Mary Frith survived that gaze. Not gracefully, not safely, not without cost. But she survived it long enough to become unforgettable. And perhaps that is the final shape of her defiance. Not that she escaped the city, but that the city never succeeded in making her sit still.